Good morning, everybody. Yes, it's great to see you all. Thanks to everybody for coming back in person and our folks that are on by Zoom. I want to thank all the speakers from yesterday, the participants, both in person and by Zoom. And I'm John Cornell. I'm with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. And on behalf of our 60 partners and over 120,000 members across the country, we're very happy to have been able to play a supportive role in putting on this extremely important and very informative migration summit. There's some folks that I would like to thank. I'm on the agenda for 15 minutes, and I'm not going to take anywhere near 15 minutes. We're going to use the extra time, why don't we, to catch up on more important business that we didn't get finished from yesterday. So, but I want to thank some folks that also were sponsors or co-sponsors that played a big role in putting this together. Obviously, the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, Jesse and his team. Jesse, stand up. While you're there, yeah. Garrett, VeneKlasen from NM Wild. Garrett, stand up. Dave and Ellenberger from Pew. Pew has supported our organizations for many, many, many years, and we are very appreciative. Brian Bird from Defenders. And I don't see Michael Dax from Wildlands Network, but Michael also played a huge role. Jeremy Romero, stand up, Jeremy. And also another big shout out, especially Adrian for all the expertise here. We couldn't have put this hybrid event together without his Game and Fish. The TRCP, we have staff in almost all the Western states, and obviously a big focus and a big priority for us in all the Western states is migration corridors and wildlife crossings. It's just so important to the work we do. And our mission statement is guaranteeing all Americans quality places to hunt and fish. And I don't know how you can do that if you're not safeguarding migration corridors and safe passage for wildlife, and not just ungulates and big game species. But if we're taking care of the habitat and the land, we're taking care of all species, big and small. And so this work is so important, and I can't emphasize that how important it is, all the work you do, the agencies, the BLM, the Forest Service here that's with us. Game and Fish has got a huge presence here. We appreciate you all participating, supporting this, and we appreciate all your great presentations and insight and extremely important information. So saying that, let's move on with the program. And I don't know, Jeremy, you want to catch up on what we didn't cover yesterday, or we just want to move into the next panel? Okay. Okay, that you were going to talk about tribal yeah, okay, we'll wait on that. Okay, so do we have, let's just go with the next panel.
Yep. Garrett, and then we have Susan Holmes.
Okay, great. How many folks do we have on Zoom this morning?
18 joining us.
18, great. Thank you all for joining us. All right, the first panel is titled 30 by 30 in connectivity. I know we're all anxious to hear more about that. Connectivity in America the Beautiful, connectivity in the state 30 by 30. We all know that is a huge priority for the administration and for our state. So we'll have Garrett, and do we have Susan by Zoom? And is Tarin Nix? We're ready for the first panel and speakers of the morning. Again, this is discussion about 30 by 30 in connectivity, and we're going to talk about the federal priorities, America the Beautiful, and our state priorities for 30 by 30. And our panelists are Garrett VeneKlasen with NM Wild, Susan Holmes with the Wildlands Network, and Tarin Nix from the Mexico State Land Office. And Garrett, you're first.
No pressure there, thanks. So I think for the benefit, I think everybody, most everybody in this room really has a good handle on what 30 by 30 is. But for the benefit of the people that are watching online, I think we need to talk a little bit about it. It's interesting. I do a lot of work with county commissions all over the state. And the American Stewards of Liberty is this Texas-based NGO that's backed by extractive industries and other people that are interested in obviously the resources on public land. And there's been a lot of misinformation out there about what 30 by 30 is. I think we need to start with just a simple fact that 30 by 30 is an ideal, right? And that ideal is that we, especially in places like New Mexico, really all over the West, we need to make sure that critical habitat is protected, permanently protected. And I think that water security and watershed security, especially for the West, is really paramount in that. And then from that ideal of water security, then we start to kind of talk about more nuanced ideas about what landscape and watershed protection should look like into the future. And obviously we're at an existential moment here in land and water and wildlife in terms of climate change. And I think that all of us are taking it very seriously. And so I think from there we have, in New Mexico especially, incredible cultural interests, traditional land uses by the indigenous Hispano and Latino communities. Obviously those core land values and interests need to be considered and also protected. And I think that protecting land and landscapes and protecting cultural interests go hand in hand. And so I live in Taos. Obviously, those communities have really, really strong ties to land, and I think that's really important to note. Wildlife corridors, obviously, that's a really critical part of what 30 by 30 should look like, and the two elements of that are obviously habitat connectivity, and then making sure that the habitats, the critical habitats between those connected landscapes are restored and as healthy as possible. And one really important note about 30 by 30 is that any sort of permanent land protection initiative, whether it be a national monument, whether it be a wilderness designation, whether it be a national park or a national preserve, is a community-driven thing. And I think that there's been some misunderstanding that 30 by 30 is some sort of blanket mandate that is going to come in and tell local communities that they're going to have to permanently do something to a landscape near them without sort of community involvement. And we know whether it's administrative protections like a national monument using the Antiquities Act, or a legislative initiative, whether it be wilderness or a national park or a wildlife refuge. All those things are very exhaustive, community inclusive processes that involve stakeholders, grasstops, grassroots, community members, also involve grazers and ranchers and people that utilize the landscape for consumptive uses. And so I can't really think of any permanent designation that doesn't include those people and does not include their interests and make sure that their interests are codified within the language of those designations. And so I think it's really important that we note that. And again, I think, and we have been talking about this within the conservation community, I think having some wildlife corridor specific legislation is a really good idea. And one area that we're talking about doing this is the Cruces Basin San Antonio Rio Grande corridor, which is obviously critical for mule deer, elk, antelope, all sorts of different species. And having some sort of piece of legislation that ensures that those herds and that wildlife movement and that habitat, coming out of Colorado and in that kind of corridor has a level of protection, and that development, that different types of development, especially mineral development, is limited in that area so that wildlife remains really healthy and robust. So it's really interesting to go around these counties again and try and inform people about what this looks like. Obviously, there's huge economic benefits. We know the numbers from outdoor recreation and, even hunting and fishing are huge numbers, and they're really beneficial, especially to rural counties. And I think that that's a really important narrative, is that economic stability, economic diversity are really important considerations. So I'm sorry. Anyway, I could go on and on about how important 30 by 30 is. It's a really inclusive process. It's a voluntary process. And obviously wildlife corridors and connecting big landscapes and habitats and watersheds is something that we're all really interested and concerned about. And Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, it being connected with some other middle Rio Grande landscapes like Caja del Rio, and then connecting those landscapes with Bandelier and Valles Caldera, for example. Those pathways and wildlife movements and corridors are something that we're all talking about within the greater conservation and agency communities in New Mexico and across the West, and those connections with our international partners like Mexico. Obviously, that corridor between northern Mexico and southern Arizona and New Mexico is probably one of the most diverse corridors in the Americas, especially in the North American continent. So it's a really interesting conversation. The 30 by 30 is a really critical thing that we need to really be serious about implementing. And again, it's about communities coming together and trying to decide what works for them. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Garrett. Appreciate that. All right, we have Susan Holmes chomping at the bit there on Zoom. So you're up next.
And should I share my screen? Is that how we're doing this?
Yes.
Right.
I'll do it for you. Susan.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, everyone. My name is Susan Holmes. I am the Federal Policy Director at the Wildlands Network, and I also am the coordinator of the Connectivity Policy Coalition, which is a coalition of groups, large and small, around the country, working on wildlife corridor, largely federal wildlife corridor policy, and also state policies as well. I'm so excited to be here. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and it's great to have connections back to New Mexico. I want to take the opportunity to thank all of you, the people who organized this conference, but also just the folks in New Mexico who have been working so hard for so long on this issue. The leadership of the state of New Mexico in the wildlife corridors and connectivity space is extraordinary. And I just want to acknowledge the amazing Senator Mimi Stewart, who is legendary here in Washington, D.C., as well as in New Mexico, for her leadership on the wildlife corridors bill in New Mexico. Senator Heinrich for his extraordinary work on this conference and many of the gatherings that have brought people together in the state of New Mexico. Also, Senator Udall, who, although he has moved on to, I don't know if it's sunnier climes or hotter right now in New Zealand, but has been a stalwart leader on both wildlife corridors as well as 30 by 30, introducing the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act in the Senate, the Tribal Wildlife Corridor Bill in the Senate, as well as being an impassioned leader on the resolution on 30 by 30. So he leaves his mark here as well. And then I want to acknowledge and thank Senator Lujan, who has taken up the baton for Senator Udall with his leadership recently introducing the Tribal Wildlife Corridor Bill, and hopefully will help to introduce the Wildlife Corridor Bill soon in the Senate. So a lot of incredible work from the state of New Mexico. And I don't know if there's something in the water out there, but you guys are extraordinary. I just want to also acknowledge this is a very important time for this issue. I started working on wildlife corridors and connectivity over 20 years ago. It was always something that a small group of people were really impassioned about, but that group has just incredibly, grown. And today it's an issue that enjoys broad support, bipartisan support. I mean, it's rare that you can find an issue that can be a priority for both the Trump administration and the Biden administration in the conservation space, and this is it. I mean, I think one of the most interesting facts I like to throw out there is that it's even included in the Pope's encyclical, Laudato Si, his letter on the environment. So from the Vatican to Washington, D.C. to New Mexico, people are working and caring about wildlife corridors and connectivity, and it's just a really exciting time. All of this energy has translated to the projects that are happening on the ground around the country and in New Mexico, as well as to this, I think, extraordinary opportunity to take advantage of 30 by 30 and this movement around the world, as well as the effort being led by the Biden administration. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So my talk today is going to look at 30 by 30 briefly, how it relates to our efforts to protect wildlife corridors, and then take a sort of glance at moving forward and how we can perhaps incorporate wildlife corridors and connectivity into the efforts moving forward on 30 by 30. I'll talk a little bit about a wildlife corridor action plan that we've developed with groups that are many of the groups here, Defenders of Wildlife, National Wildlife Federation, the Endangered Species Coalition, and other organizations have worked on a plan of action for wildlife corridors, and I'll touch on that briefly. So let's start with just 30 by 30. I think many of you know the challenges that we face, but I think it makes sense to take a look at the incredible need that we have to protect this much land at this time. As we know from scientists, 75% of our land environments and 66% of marine environments have been severely altered by human activities. And 12,000 animal and plant species in the US are really in significant need of active work if we're going to get them off the path to extinction. Only 12% of US lands are currently protected from development. But the good news is that 60% of US lands are still considered to be in a relatively natural state. So this is where the opportunity lies. We still have time. We don't have maybe much time, but we still have time. And we need to grab this opportunity right now. And I sort of want to pause just to acknowledge also the late E.O. Wilson, who was a huge champion of wildlife corridors and connectivity. But it's really the 30 by 30, the genesis of this was one that was based on the need to protect biodiversity. And his idea was that we need to protect 50% of the land to stabilize 80% of Earth species. Well, 30% would be a really good down payment on that. And that's why I think, Wildlands Network and so many of us believe that this is such an important initiative at this time. So next slide. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the 30 by 30 and the America Beautiful initiative, which is the initiative from the Biden administration. It stems from the executive order 14008, which directs the Department of Interior to coordinate with other agencies to establish a process to get to 30% by 2030, and it also requires a report to measure the progress. And the principles for this America the Beautiful initiative, I think, are important. There are 8 of them, and as you'll see, if you look through them, they are very much acknowledging the role of collaboration, of local stakeholders, the need to honor tribal sovereignty and the importance of tribes, private property rights, and building on existing tools and strategies. And I think you can see here how wildlife corridors and connectivity fits into so many of these principles, and I think why wildlife corridors and connectivity has risen to the top of the priorities for the Biden administration, because so many of things in the connectivity space overlap with these fundamental principles that are at the heart of the America the Beautiful initiative, which is designed to implement the 30 by 30 pledge. So next slide. So wildlife connectivity is a clear and significant priority for the Biden administration as part of the America the Beautiful initiative. And this language is taken from the report that came out in December, but as acknowledged out of the gate, wildlife corridors was always going to be, I think, a significant focus for this administration. You can see that they have, enumerated it in a number of different ways. They want the agencies to work with states, tribes, and local communities to establish and expand wildlife corridors and connectivity, as well as expanding on Secretarial Order 3362, which has been such an amazing success, led by the phenomenal Casey Stemler, who you all heard from yesterday. So with that to build on, I think the administration is clearly looking at opportunities where we can expand and grow connectivity and build off the existing local activities that are happening around the country. So next slide. So one of the focuses of this America the Beautiful initiative and one of the significant tools is the American Conservation and Stewardship Atlas. Now, this is an atlas that is going to be part of this implementation of 30 by 30, and it's led by a number of agencies under the auspices of the Council on Environmental Quality, or the White House. And it's designed to bring together information so that we can both get a baseline for where we are with 30 by 30, but then also measure the progress towards that goal. Recently, the administration put out the Atlas for comments, and not surprisingly, the Wildlands Network, and I'm sure many of your organizations commented, and we believe that this atlas should include wildlife connectivity for terrestrial and avian aquatic species. We emphasize the importance of that, as well as including key wildlife infrastructure like overpasses, underpasses, et cetera, including core habitats. And here, I was really heartened to hear about the emphasis on borderlands and partnering with Mexico. We think, obviously, the US is not an island. We connect with habitats both north and south. And so we think that the Atlas should also include this so that we can determine the best strategies to try to support those linkages as well. And then finally, we really do want to underscore the importance of using data and information from the people on the ground who are doing the work, like the state of New Mexico, tribes, NGOs, et cetera. So those are some of our top line comments, and we're looking forward to seeing what happens with this atlas. Again, I think it will be a useful tool to incorporate wildlife connectivity into 30 by 30. Next slide. So, as I said, we, with a number of other organizations, including National Parks Conservation Association, Defenders of Wildlife, NWF, and others, put together a wildlife corridor action plan for the Biden administration in the context of this 30 by 30 implementation. And so I'm just going to take you through some of the things that we believe the administration should be thinking about as it implements 30 by 30 and gears up its agencies and its capacity to be able to take on what is a pretty ambitious target, but one that we think is very, very, it's doable and important to achieve. So this first step that we think that we need to do together is to identify wildlife corridors. And this would include strengthening the role of the USGS corridor mapping team, including technical assistance to tribes and others, and expanding the data to include non-game species. Again, the identification of wildlife corridors by the agencies is critically important as a first step in order to move into the important role of conserving wildlife corridors. So that gets us to step 2, which is our protect, manage, and manage wildlife corridors. Here, we think that the agencies, and we're so appreciative of the work that the Forest Service and BLM are doing now to incorporate wildlife corridors and connectivity. But we recognize that there needs to be more. We need to have more resources flowing to these agencies for planning. We need to update some of these plans and amend them to include wildlife corridors and connectivity. We need to expand or build on Executive Order 3362. I know Casey was talking about maybe not changing 3362, but maybe creating more opportunities like 3362 to include more species, cover a broader geography. We think it's a great model. We think that we need to do more though. So that's, I think, another opportunity. And finally, I think, we see a lot of opportunity right now to sort of invest in the agencies to update their policies, to integrate habitat connectivity into really what they're doing. And I know so much of that is starting to go on, but trying to formalize that in a way that provides support and direction to the agencies, we think is important. So next slide. So step 3 would be to facilitate coordination and collaboration. Again, this conference is a testimony to the importance of bringing folks together. We recognize that that is something that happens more and more, but could, we always could do better. Bringing together USDA, Department of Interior, Department of Transportation, and the other federal family land management and water management agencies, I think we would have a greater opportunity to share and collaborate across landscapes and across areas of expertise. So we're hoping that we can establish a formal interagency coordinating committee. We're heartened to know that the CEQ has started to pull together groups or folks from the different agencies to begin a discussion, I think, in this space, which is exciting. We also recognize the importance of collaboration with the regional, tribal, and state wildlife authorities, governments, and other stakeholders. So that's, again, fundamental to what we need to do and what we need to build out, and to supply the necessary resources for that. And then step 4 is money. We need money. We're going to need money to do this. And so we are actively looking for sources of funds, both within existing budgets and bringing more money to the table. Exciting. I think you spoke about it yesterday, the $350 million from the infrastructure bill that recently passed for wildlife crossings in the new pilot program is incredibly exciting. Access to more money from the Farm Bill, Partners for Fish and Wildlife, and existing programs like that, I think can go a long way to start to build out the capacity that we need. In addition, there's over $2 billion in the recently passed infrastructure bill for ecosystem restoration activities, and we're going to be looking at opportunities there. And then finally, we think that we should pass a wildlife corridors bill to provide additional funds, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So one of the requests that we have for the Biden administration and for Congress is to pass the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act and the Tribal Wildlife Corridor Act. These two bills were both passed by the U.S. House of Representatives in 2020 and 2021 with bipartisan support, which has been so exciting to see. As we said, this is an issue that's really brought people together and has extraordinary momentum. In the previous Congress, Senator Udall and now Senator introduced the Corridors Bill, and now Senator Lujan introduced the Tribal Wildlife Corridors Act in this session of Congress. And the bill, the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, is a comprehensive bill to connect wildlife corridors on federal public lands, as well as to support wildlife corridors and connectivity on state, tribal, and private lands. And it would cover a range of species, including migratory game species, but also fish, birds, even plants could be covered by the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act. And it is broadly supported by hundreds of NGOs, scientists, outdoor recreation. An extraordinary coalition of groups has come around together, again, with bipartisan support in the House. So it's been exciting to see it get as far as it has. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act has not yet been introduced in the Senate, and we're hoping to do that soon. Next slide. So just to break down a little bit of the benefits of what this could do and why it would be so important as part of the 30 by 30 effort. The Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act would bring $50 million per year to private landowners, state agencies, tribes, local governments, NGOs, et cetera, and particularly the collaborative partnerships I know that many of you have worked with for habitat connectivity on non-federal lands. It would also provide $50 million for wildlife predator protection on tribal lands. It grants authority and resources to key federal agencies to identify and protect wildlife corridors on federal public lands using existing planning processes. And it does a lot to foster collaboration between agencies and support local partnerships that are working in communities at the local level to advance wildlife corridor protection. Next slide. So, so that's the Wildlife Corridors Conservation Act, but and some of the federal initiatives that I've been working on here from Washington, D.C. Around the country, though, we're also seeing 30 by 30 take off in a number of states. And I just want to highlight a couple of the state efforts. 50%, I think, of the legislation that's been introduced on 30 by 30 at the state level has incorporated wildlife corridors and connectivity, which is exciting to see. In California, that was the first 30 by 30 initiative that was started in October 2020. And it has pretty substantial connectivity provisions. The draft plan includes core priorities to support ecosystem resilience. And it also prioritizes the acquisition of lands adjacent to established public lands. So the checkerboards, I know that there was a map that circulated yesterday, trying to address some of that checkerboard or looking at that as an opportunity to expand and improve habitat and climate. It also coordinates acquisitions to increase connectivity between, again, the existing conserved lands, restored habitats, and it utilizes some of the latest science from the recent reports. So it is grounded in a lot of the key priorities for connectivity, and it's very exciting to see. Next slide. But in New Mexico, you are, I would say, a close second maybe to California in putting connectivity, and not surprisingly, connectivity and wildlife corridors in your 30 by 30 initiative that was signed in August of 2021. As you know, the EO must meet certain standards and goals, and it explicitly says to support migratory wildlife habitat and ensure movement across the landscape. So that's very, very exciting. All right, so next slide. And then a few of the other initiatives, just to give you a little bit of a laundry list that are going on. Maine also enumerates wildlife corridors and in connectivity in its 30 by 30 initiative. There are a number of other 30 by 30 initiatives around the country that don't have explicit wildlife corridors and connectivity, and you'll see the list here: Hawaii, Illinois, Nevada, et cetera. But I wanted to also mention that there are 9 states around the country that have passed wildlife corridor legislation. And it is a range of blue and red states, everything from New Mexico and Oregon, Florida, Virginia, my backyard, New Hampshire, and Wyoming have enacted habitat connectivity legislation. And then there are a number of other states that have introduced legislation or issued executive orders, a number of states that have pending legislation. So we're hoping that those 9 states, that number will grow over the next few years. And it really has been a movement led in large part by New Mexico, and the example and template that you have set for and frankly set a nice, very high bar for wildlife corridor legislation around the country. So we're so appreciative of really the trend that you guys have started, and hopeful that we will continue to see more wildlife corridor bills at the state level, and hopefully they'll be as strong and as well supported as the New Mexico one. And the last slide. So that's just a little bit of a tour of 30 by 30 and wildlife corridors and connectivity. I again, thank you for the time and all the work that you all have been doing so hard in New Mexico. And would love to hear from you if you have any questions, but also we have a connectivity policy listserv for groups and individuals that are interested in joining up with the discussion and resource exchange that we do there. So if you're interested in joining up with that, or any more information about getting involved with the Connectivity Policy Coalition, please don't hesitate to reach out and let me know.
Thank you, Susan, for spending the morning with us and for that great presentation. We really appreciate it. All right, moving on. Next on the agenda is Tarin Nix with our own state land office. Tarin.
Morning. We are excited to be here today. I know that y'all got to hear from my boss, Commissioner Stephanie Garcia Richard, yesterday morning. So I hope you enjoyed her as much as we do at the land office. You know, when we think about 30 by 30 at the land office, it's not only in relation to our 9 million acres that we manage, but in, you know, how it works with the checkerboard nature of our state. You know, for those that don't know, we have about almost 78 million acres in New Mexico. That would mean about 23 million acres would need to be conserved on some level to meet the 30 by 30 requirements. And about 35% are managed by the feds, 11% by the tribes and pueblos, and 11% managed by us. And so when we kind of think about how much cross-jurisdictional collaboration and cooperation will be required, not only to do wildlife corridor management, obviously, but to achieve these goals, it makes us kind of really look at how we're defining conservation and how we still maintain and fulfill our constitutional mandate. So for those of you that don't know, the New Mexico State Land Office was gifted our land by Congress prior to New Mexico becoming an official state. Our boss's position technically was here before the governor's position. We are responsible for raising money for our public schools, our colleges, universities, and other public institutions that are listed in our Constitution, 19 of them. So we have 2 mandates, one to raise money and second to assure the health of the state lands for the benefit of future generations. So if we have to raise money off of our lands, obviously full restrictions of our land is not really a viable solution for the state land office. And so how do we kind of get there, and what do we kind of suggest in this process? I'm not going to go into as much detail as everyone else because I'm not nearly the expert that they are. But I want to talk a little bit about how our lands work. 90% of our land right now, our 9 million acres, is used, we consider it working lands. It is used by our agricultural community. We believe that the benefit of that work should be recognized in the 30 by 30 Atlas, from the establishment of simple buffer zones around urban areas to the protection of wildlife corridors and the protection of clean water and biodiversity. Working land should be included, and certain categories and standards of range management should also be established that qualify as conserved lands. So if we can find a way to monetize conservation and also preserve our land, we can actually be a real big key player in achieving the 30 by 30 goals. Currently, just so you know, most of our money from the land office comes from oil and gas. We also do obviously a lot of agriculture, outdoor recreation, renewable energy projects, but we're always kind of striving to incorporate some appropriate conservation protections as part of the process. When we really look at our constitutional mandate in conservation and how it needs to be monetized on some level, we kind of look at the landscape level scale that we need to collaborate not only with our neighbors, But also we understand that watersheds do not know political boundaries, and that we obviously have the ability at the State Land Office to be very flexible in both our instruments that we lease, our instruments that we go into agreement with individuals, as well as requiring certain activities, prohibiting others in terms of timescale. So like what we do right now in terms of conservation, that we would hope that if we can get the definition to be a little bit more nuanced, and I'll get to that here in a minute, there are some ways that we are already currently doing actions that we think would go hand in hand with 30 by 30. We have conservation programs. That means that with the exception of oil and gas leases that are set by statute, and we have to go to the legislature to do any kind of modification, we have been able to create leasing instruments to establish state parks, recreation areas, or just access in general to protect critical habitat and wildlife, obviously the conservation corridors and the wildlife corridors, to mitigate damages, to protect critical ecosystem services, and for like study and research. While we have a couple of organizations that have leases on our land and it's for research and for wildlife studies. And so we would consider those to be very much maintained and part of this 30 by 30 process. As we mentioned, 90% of our 9 million acres is agriculturally leased up, but that is ranching and farming activities. They provide protection against waste and trespass, as well as a stewardship of the rangelands. That kind of, we'll get to that climate change and what that means for how we look at conservation at the Land Office. We have the ability to do land use restriction codes in our system, LERCs. We can literally, if you will pay for the mineral estate at the Land Office, you can take that land completely out of use. Or I guess maybe used for public recreation only. But we do have that ability at the Land Office, and it's expensive when you think about the mineral estate that we do have underneath our ground in a lot of places. We do restoration or remediation. We are allowed to use 1% of our money that we raise in renewable funding, so not oil and gas royalties, but pretty much everything else. We get 1% of that to go and help restore our land. Whether that is, tree removal, watershed restoration, it kind of ranges depending on what the need is. But again, that is work that we would hope at some point would be considered in part of this discussion. And then land exchanges, that's the one that most of y'all probably know about. We are currently in the process of doing a major land exchange with BLM in the Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks, and as well as we will do a second one for a northern area. But it will be over 100,000 acres. And so while that land obviously will be considered at the federal level, once it becomes their possession, we believe that at the State Land Office, that counts as part of our 30 by 30 contribution to ensure that that land is managed properly and taken care of for generations to come. I mentioned the definition of conservation. So according to our expert, Will Barnes, who is on vacation, so he is not gracing me with his presence, unfortunately, today, there is a major difference in the way that the current atlas defines conservation actions from the different classifications. And basically what our work does and the way that we monetize conservation and make money off of it, whether it's carbon sequestration or LERCs, is defined underneath their GAP3 definition, which would not be covered currently in what would be accepted under a 30 by 30 definition of conservation of land. For us, virtually all of our lands may require management to repair an ecosystem function and restore resiliency to impacted systems. For example, improving watershed health requires significant restoration actions to protect water resources, biodiversity, and other ecological services. The definition of conservation should therefore include nuances of land management found in GAP3. GAP3 is an opportunity to recognize the conservation value of the forest management plans and other science-based ecological restoration planning efforts. Sorry, I'm having to skip around because some of my talking points were taken earlier. Let's see. Now this. So like one of the main things that we've been doing in the north, it's dual as a win-win process. So the residents in the north are beholden to burning fuel for heat during the winter. So we do a lot of work right now with the land grants up in the north to go and do just listening, to do fuel wood management, I guess, is what you would call it, right? Anyway, to take out the land, to make sure that the land doesn't burn down the road, but also to provide a heat source for residents. From our, the way we look at it, the currently defined fuel wood management would push lands out of GAP 2 definition in Atlas and push it into GAP 3, even though it's out of what has traditionally been considered conserved lands. We think extensive peer-reviewed science has established that the activity has substantial conservation benefits. And so I think that from us, it's just looking at how we really get at that definition of conservation to make it more inclusive. I mean, same thing with the wildlife corridors. It would need to be also part of that expansion and have a look at this goal. And Garrett touched on it, but I always want to bring it back that at least in the current conversation that's being had at 30 by 30, we feel very strongly at the land office that from a tribal perspective, it is pretty non-existent. And they have proven for generations upon generations that they know how to manage this land better than anybody. And in this state alone, obviously 11% of ownership is a lot, but also it means that we owe it on so many levels to get this correct. And at our office, we adhere to the 5 principles of respect for tribal sovereignty and traditional communities, respect for private property rights, the need to adapt to changing climate, and their critical importance in working lands and the benefits of collaboration. So I just always want to bring it back that wish someone from Mescalero was here to talk about what that looks like for them, because they are the best at management. So anyway, thank you for having us.
Thank you, Tarin, and thank you all speakers. And now yes, Mr. VeneKlasen, you have the floor.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing. I've been having interesting conversations with Tabor Ward this morning and with Kathy McKim. I think what we need to do sooner than later is have an implementation summit that not only focuses on wildlife corridors, but also 30 by 30 in general. And I think, 30 by 30 is still across the country and even in New Mexico is just an idea, but how do we implement it? And I think that we need to bring together all the stakeholders. I think that Kathy made an interesting point that we need to have private landowners in the room. And so it would be good to have them at the table. This Armandaris conservation easement that Mark Watson mentioned earlier, 350,000 acres in a permanent conservation easement is a massive thing. And so, and Tarin had mentioned the important role the tribes are going to play in this. But I think it would be really beneficial for all of us to have a 30 by 30 implementation summit of some sort. And obviously connectivity and wildlife corridors are a really integral part of that. And then of course, having our agency partners, Game and Fish, BLM, Forest Service, National Park Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, State Land Office, of course, in that summit. I think we can come together and having ranchers, grazers, all the different stakeholders at the table, and really having an inclusive sort of community-driven conversations, I think would be really beneficial and proactive. 30 by 30 has become this really kind of strange reactive thing, which is silly. And New Mexico, we have a lot of differences, but we're really good at coming together and figuring these things out. So I would love to see an implementation meeting happen in a central location like New Mexico. And Jesse, you're so good at putting together summits. But I think that would be really a great next step. And again, corridors and connectivity should be a big part of that implementation sort of strategy thing. Mexico Transportation, Department of Transportation, obviously at the table too. So this thought came up. And one last thing, from an acquisition standpoint, Elbar, this amazing private property is going to be purchased and become part of the Marquez wildlife management area managed by the Game and Fish Department. Really great example of how an acquisition can really impact connectivity. Obviously, it's close to Mount Taylor, really diverse habitat and wildlife values. that will really protect big herds of animals and really diverse species. The Clower property up south of Taos on the east side of Highway 68, 3,800 acres. Where I hit my elk last winter, the Clower property is right adjacent to that. And one of the problems on Highway 68, it's interesting, me coming down from Taos yesterday morning, I almost hit another elk in the exact place where I hit the elk last winter. And we could do restoration projects on that Clower project property. The Taos on 68, the elk cross 68 to eat grass in the golf course. And then they bed in the Pinot and Juniper on the east side of the highway. Well, the Clower property, the Game and Fish Department and BLM could do some restoration projects to keep those elk off of the golf course. They could, we could do some grass projects and stuff like the water projects. That's a really great example of acquisition and utilizing restoration to address and mitigate, these hotspots. And so I just wanted to mention two actual examples of acquisition projects that really will have a big impact on habitat quality and restoration and mitigating specific hotspots.
Thank you. Thank you, Garrett. Sounds like you need to slow down a little bit with that pickup, driving in around Taos. All right, we'll open it up for questions. We have 35 folks joining us on Zoom, which is excellent. Thank you all. And we welcome your questions for any of our three panelists. Anybody from the forum, Mr. Dax?
I'm not sure if any of, if you can, but can anyone speak to progress that's made on implementation of the executive order and meetings of the 30 by 30 task force that will take place since the executive order was issued in August?
I'm sorry, say that one more time.
Curious about what progress has been made on the executive order from Michelle Lumberson in meetings from the 30 by 30 task force that have taken place since August, since the executive order.
I'm not on that task force. Brittany, are you on the task force?
I know that Will has done at least 2 meetings. Am I correct? Ooh. So, and so for us, I know that we have submitted stuff from on a federal level as well.
I think that's a great question. Again, implementation and actually getting something done specifically is the most important part of the conversation. So I think it's one of the best questions that we need to be asking, and how do we take that task force and get stakeholders in the room and actually start to implement a statewide plan.
Yeah, and I think it'd be great to see more public participation opportunities as part of that, and it'd probably help push back against any narratives that it is a land grab or kind of some of the things that you were addressing earlier, Garrett.
I wanted to follow up on Michael's question. This is Brittany Fallon with New Mexico Wild. The 30 by 30 task force, from my understanding, is still considering how to define what it means for something to be conserved, which I appreciate is very difficult to do when you're talking about all the different types of lands that exist in New Mexico and what the various agencies or tribes authorities are to do work on those lands. I think last Friday in the Albuquerque Journal, there was an article about 30 by 30, a county commission presentation that happened at Farmington. And there were some quotes in that article from the Energy and Minerals Department stating that they were not going to be recommending any wilderness as part of the state 30 by 30, which I do not support that as a position. And I'm seeing Tarin shaking her head. And I wanted to ask Tarin.
Aw.
No pressure.
I think the land office has been an excellent model for how we can utilize state trust land, but still support designations like ODP, the work, the land exchanges you're doing there. And I wanted to know if the land office sees future opportunities like that as part of a state 3530 initiative.
I mean, we have actually, I think, 2 conversations going on right now about potentially new state parks. I don't know of any additional conversations in terms of land exchanges with the BLM for any other additional areas that no one's come to us saying, please get this going. And it also is like a minimum 5-year process. So just so we're all very clear that it's a very time consuming. We do have some discussions going on right now in the Valle de Oro, so that would be like 120 acres, but again, not substantial. I think that for us, it is, scary that the idea of 30 by 30 would be all about acquisitions and walling off land. Again, we feel like most of our land is very accessible and very open and very managed and maintained, and the activities that we do that generate money, and ag generates very little, but it's still money and it meets our mandate. And to have that land or our state parks, because we have 5 state parks on state trust land, that they wouldn't be included in that number would definitely be I don't know how we would help get to any kind of resolve at the land office if we can't use that land in that way.
Thank you. Thank you for the work that the land office is doing, because it's really admirable and I think shows flexibility that we're going to need as a state to get to 30 by 30, but also as a nation to get to 30 by 30. And just for the audience, I want to reiterate, New Mexico Wild doesn't think that wilderness is the only answer to protecting 30 by 30, but it's a substantial part of the equation, and it protects land in ways that other designations don't, while still allowing access for a variety of reasons, including for most recreational purposes. And I would hate to see the state discount the importance of wilderness when there's so much land in New Mexico that already, for example, is part of federal study areas that could be absorbed into wilderness it's adjacent to without using the phrase term walling off land for other purposes.
I just did want to also note that, wilderness is only 3%, in New Mexico, it's only 3% of land are designated as wilderness. One other thing, the Colorado state trust land, they have a percentage of their lands in a conservation easement. And it would take a constitutional amendment because of the fiduciary duties of the agency itself. But I think it's something that New Mexico should consider, is to model the Colorado model with New Mexico, because there really are state trust lands that do have incredible watershed, cultural and wildlife values, and having a percentage of those in some sort of conservation easement, I think would be really beneficial. And I think that we should also be talking about legislative action on implementing that. It's a heavy lift, but I think we as a greater community should be talking about that.
There's a question from the Zoom audience. Glenn Harper, who joined us yesterday from Santa Ana. Regarding lands included in the 30 by 30, what classification or status does an acre fall under when it's included in the 30%? What authority would protect it into the future, and what land uses could still occur on it?
I'd take a stab at that. And I think that Brittany, you sort of highlighted the point that on almost all conserved lands, consumptive uses like hunting, fishing, grazing are allowed and actually mandated in the actual language of the mandate itself. And there's lots of different there's lots of different angles to this. The Game and Fish Department with their wildlife management areas, like the Elbar, for example. ONRW, which is Outstanding Natural Resource Waters, protects watersheds and gives them a water quality standard. That's a state-based mandate. National monuments, national parks and preserves, special management areas, wild and scenic designations, state parks, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, wildlife refuges, legislative mineral withdrawals, wilderness, and then conservation easement on private lands are really good examples of, I think, ideas on how we can implement 30 by 30. And again, every single one of these mandates are community driven. I think that this is one of the misinformation points, is that you don't get a wilderness designation without exhaustive congressional processes. You don't get a national monument designation without county commission resolutions and buy-in and stakeholder buy-in. So none of these designations can happen without really inclusive, transparent community action. And that's where it puts the power of 30 by 30 in local communities. And so nobody needs to be afraid of it. They're not going to wake up one morning and have a giant wilderness in their backyard unless the community wants to have that happen. And so I think that's a really important part.
All right, Mr. Byrd, you have a question, and then Leslie will get you next. Thank you.
Yeah, Brian Byrd with Defenders Wildlife. I just want to mention that I've heard from one person on Zoom that they have a hard time hearing the audience on that Zoom little Alexa device. I'd like to offer maybe a little bit of a different model about how we define how an acre gets into 30 by 30. And I think I want to recognize the constitutional requirements for the State Land Office. I also want to recognize Brittany and Mesco Wild in that wilderness and other designations like outstanding waters or monuments. Those are all really important. And obviously at Defenders Wildlife, we support those. But I'd like to remind ourselves that I think the initiative, or sort of the impetus behind 30 by 30 really was to address the biodiversity and the climate crisis. So it really is the idea behind it, and it was developed by the world's leading scientists on biodiversity, is to stem the loss of biodiversity and stem the climate crisis, and even maybe reverse it. So I wonder if there's a better way to include all kinds of working lands, because one of the reasons I've chosen New Mexico to live is because of our open space and our, that has extreme value to me, just being able to drive from Albuquerque to Santa Fe and look out for many, many miles at open space. So all of these, they all have value, but maybe the best way to perhaps define an acre is by somehow measuring whether or not we are protecting biodiversity on that acre, and even increasing the biodiversity on that acre, and whether or not that acre acts as a carbon sink, or at least a carbon bank.
Yeah.
So those are ways you can actually measure those two things. Those are measurable items. So we go out and we say this acre has this much biodiversity. We don't want that biodiversity to decrease at all. In fact, we'd like to see it increase. And then on carbon, it's pretty easy to go out on an acre of grassland and say, measure, the soil and plant carbon, and say, it's going to be a net zero, or it's going to increase its carbon bank, make it a carbon bank. So I guess I would just throw that out there as another way. It's going to cost money, and it's going to be complex because you have to monitor those things. But that might be another way to add to just the idea that we're going to put an acre away as some kind of conserved designation. So I know that's a lot for people on Zoom. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Brian. Do any of the panelists want to comment on that? All right, Leslie in the back of the room has a question.
Good morning, Leslie Fish Walker. Used to Forest Service.
She's already.
Well, for the leader Southwestern region. For the people on Zoom. So I'm wondering, we haven't received any direction yet on the.
Hey, if it sounds like there's gonna be a preface, and I want there to be a preface, I wonder if it would make sense if you stand right next to the owl here, and then we'll loan you one of our microphones, and then I think we should all be able to hear you.
Got the extra mic in. Good idea.
Come on over.
Come on up.
Sorry,
Can't
folks.
hear
on Zoom,
you on
we're-
Zoom. You have to talk into that mic.
So the Zoom microphone is right here.
This is live too.
Is that okay? I'm sorry about that. No, don't mean to put you on the spot. Yeah, just stand right over here. Yeah, perfect.
All right, do I have to face y'all?
Very
to
close
hold
to the
hands.
mic, face. So look up here, look at the owl, look at Zoom.
Can you climb up on the table?
Sorry, folks.
Okay,
I
so,
think the folks should be able to hear you a lot better.
okay, so
Yeah.
Leslie Hay, Forest Service, Wildlife Program Leader, Southwestern Region, for the people on Zoom. The question, well, first of all, a statement, then two questions. So the statement is, we haven't, in the Forest Service anyway, received direction yet on the 30 by 30 from the Washington office, but there's a lot of discussion about it, right? One of the questions that are out there floating around, and certainly I think has already come up in this meeting today, is there somewhat of a stratification, or maybe it would be a spectrum, if you will, on the level of protection conservation within the 30 by 30, such that higher level of protection could be wilderness, for example, all the way out to more multiple use, some of our Forest Service lands, BLM lands, et cetera. Is there discussion about that within the 30 by 30 for percentages or something like that? That's question number one. And then question number two is, what agencies are on this New Mexico task force?
Yeah, so I think the task force has all the different state agencies that obviously have sort of a stake in this. The Game and Fish is on the task force. MNRD is on the task force. State Land Office is on the task force. NMED is on the task force. Who else? Ag. Yeah, and State Forestry, yeah, part of MNRD. So I think that's the makeup of the task force. And then your second question about percentages of lands and sort of grading criteria, I think is a really interesting one. And obviously the different designations that I had mentioned, national monuments, for example, really are based on multiple use. Rio Grande del Norte, you can ride your ATV there. You can, obviously it's travel management. You can mountain bike, hike, bird watch, all of those things. But even wilderness, you know, grazing is allowed on wilderness and actually mandated within the language of wilderness designation. So Columbine Hondo up in Taos, near Taos, for example, the grazers obviously are still grazing on that land. Pequos Wilderness has a real diverse suite of grazing allotments also. So
And I know that just from our perspective, we submitted comments to the work that's being done at the state level, and suggested a lot of what you just said, right? That like reforestation, migration, invasive species management, like all of that should be included in terms of how we define it. But our staff really felt like what is currently being proposed from a mapping perspective and from a data perspective is lacking. And there were about 3 pages in our suggestions about data that could be included, including best management practices from tribes, but just even how we define and look at kind of jurisdictions and zones of wildlife and what, you know, landscape, that it's not really, that conversation is not there yet in the atlas. So yeah, I think it's still a work in progress. So, but I'll happily take back the public comment suggestion and find out, and we can, you know, kind of let folks know.
Another question on the Zoom for Tarin. If you could just speak again to the land exchange, I believe it was the 100,000 acre piece you spoke about with BLM.
Yeah.
It's just a clarifying question, I guess.
Oh, my point is, I would hope that that land, when it goes to the feds, would be included in the 30 by 30 number. Maybe if it's wildlife area not included, then I don't know. But we are doing right now, we are in the process and about to very publicly announce the Oregon Mountain Desert Peak land exchange with BLM. We had hoped to do a kind of all of the areas that are within the mountain, the national monuments and wilderness areas currently in New Mexico that are state trust land. We were hoping to get all of them off at one time, but it's just too big of a thing. So we're doing about 100,000 acre land swap right now with BLM and the Oregon Mountain Desert Peak. And so we hope to have that one wrapped up. We would love by the end of the year, but probably by the first of the next year.
And I just add that the acreages within those national monuments, Rio Grande del Norte and Oregon Mountain Peaks, are of course considered part of 30 by 30 because they do have a layer of protection. So absolutely.
And another question from our good friend Glenn Harper on Zoom. I'm just going to read it directly as it's typed. Pardon my ignorance, but if I understood correctly, lands that are already protected in some way, either by their status, such as federally or state-owned wilderness, wildlife areas, or parks or monuments, would be included in the 30%. I was under the impression that the 30% would presumably be new land designations.
I think that's a really good question. I think from New Mexico's standpoint, if New Mexico is trying to reach 30% of its landscapes having some sort of level of protection, that the lands that we have already designated in one of those forms of protection should be considered part of that 30%. Although I think that New Mexico should aspire to have more than 30% of its land permanently protected by 2030. I think that, again, New Mexico thinks differently and that we should aspire to have as much land permanently protected as we possibly can because of our water challenges, because of the biodiversity comment that you made, Brian, that, you know, what is the aesthetic, what is the economic, what is the cultural value of that protection? It's priceless, right? And I think that it will pay massive dividends 100 years from now, right? Where New Mexico will have this suite of protected private, tribal, public, state lands that no one else has. And again, our cultural identity is so tied to that. Our indigenous, our Hispano, and Latino heritage is so tied to that. What an incredible investment that will be for our children's children 100 years in the future.
And Susan on Zoom, did you want to chime in on anything? We've got about 5 minutes left. It looks like we may have one more audience question, but did you want to chime in on anything so far?
I think you guys are doing great. I'll just, add, I think as to the percentages, we're waiting to hear more from the administration about their strategies for implementation of 30 by 30. My understanding is that the 12% that we're looking at across the US means that that's the baseline that we're starting from, and we need to get up to 30%. So those would be, looking at what are the opportunities there and trying to determine what counts, I think is a really big question. And one that, we haven't really heard the opinion of the administration on how they're going to grapple with that quite yet, but we're waiting to see.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And it looks like we have one more audience question.
Thank you, Adrian. This is more of a comment than a question, I think. At the beginning of your presentation, Garrett, you were talking about some of the opposition to 30 by 30. And a lot of that opposition consists of fear mongering and misinformation. And I've been contacted by a lot of people who are heavily engaged in the hunting and the activities of hunting and fishing, who have been misinformed that 30 by 30 is a direct attack on those activities. And so I just wanted to flag, maybe Adrian can put it in the chat, but there is a website called Hunt Fish 3030. And what you'll see is organizations from across the country that are sporting organizations support 30 by 30, because we recognize this as something that's very positive to the future of hunting and angling, and certainly not something that would have a negative impact on those activities. So I just wanted to clarify that and clear up any misinformation that's been spread.
I think that's a really good point. And again, the designations, whether it's a national monument or, Valles Caleta is a national preserve. Great Sand Dunes up in Colorado is a national preserve, allows hunting, allows fishing. So wilderness, of course, allows hunting and fishing. And so almost all of the designations that we're talking about, obviously state parks, fishing is a kind of a primary and central part to that. So again, these consumptive uses and designation, permanent designation, almost always go hand in hand. Grazing as well. So.
And I think for our final question, which is more than apt, coming again from our good friend Glenn Harper. Last question: where do we currently stand with protected lands in terms of 30 by 30? What percentages are we at, and how much do we need to reach that 30%?
I would just say that we haven't made that calculation yet, because if you, if you include state parks, if you include wildlife management areas, I don't think that we've actually made that calculation. And Brittany, you may have more details on that percentage. It'd be great to get that information. So.
The estimate I've seen from environmental groups that were part of the grassroots swell behind a state 30 by 30 is 6% of New Mexico, which includes all different types of lands, is protected. One thing that MNRD has mentioned recently is that 70% of New Mexico is unpaved. Therefore, those lands have potential for restoration projects that could get them to be included. And one thing that I would like to say is just because something is unpaved doesn't mean it's good habitat or that it's good climate resiliency.
All right, I think that's probably it for the time limit on this panel. Just a couple of things in closing. The question was brought up, and I believe that Gap 1 lands, which are the higher level of protections, certainly already count towards the 30 by 30 initiative. To Michael and Leslie's question about implementation, I would hope that the mandate in the 30 by 30 executive order from the governor, which directs cabinet secretaries or task force to come up with a report on the pathway forward, will be presented to her in July. I would hope that would become public after that for public comment, and hopefully have an idea on how and where we're going to be able to get this thing moving. And one common theme that I heard from everybody, and it's the theme of this summit, is that the identification, assessment, and management of wildlife corridors are going to be critical and important in moving forward in the 30 by 30 initiative. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll move on to the next panel.
Next panel, the last of the day. People could get in their seats, that'd be great. All right, well, thank you. I'm David Ellenberger. I'm a senior associate with the Pew Charitable Trust. I work with our U.S. Public Lands and Rivers Conservation team based in Portland, Oregon. But I work in the states of New Mexico, and all the great groups that are represented and help put on this summit, I get the honor of working with every week and coordinating closely with. Also, I work in the states of Colorado and California on wildlife connectivity issues and helping to get more wildlife crossings built in the West. And I think we have a really excellent panel today that's going to kind of delve into the issue of, pipeline projects that have been completed or ones that are coming online, funding mechanisms to help deploy wildlife infrastructure, the planning behind those projects and the designs and how their effectiveness for a suite of different species that need to use these wildlife bridges and underpasses to help maintain and access habitat. So I just want to say, oftentimes when people ask me what I work on for my day job, I kind of tell them, generally about this, and oftentimes people say, oh, I went to Banff National Park and I saw those wildlife bridges, that are so prominent there. And those were built, I think, more than almost 25 years ago now. But the cool thing is that we're starting to see a renaissance, with the advent of low-cost GPS monitoring collars for wildlife. They can now tell us exactly where they want to go and exactly where they want to cross roads. And we can now help facilitate that. And I think in the next few years, Banff won't be the poster child. We'll have places in New Mexico. We'll have crossings in Colorado and other places that people now see in their drives across the West and their scenic roadways that we have here. And we'll start to see a real renaissance in providing access and roads for wildlife, where we provided, numerous roads for motorists and whatnot in our country. Wildlife are now going to be the beneficiaries, I think, of the next phase. So with that, I'll introduce Michael Dax with the Wildlands Network, and I think he's going to talk a little bit about all of, after we had all of these executive orders and statewide legislation like the Wildlife Corridors Act of 2019 here in New Mexico, we've now started to see plans like the Wildlife Corridors Action Plan come about, and those plans need money, to get those crossings built and implemented. And I think Michael's going to talk a little bit more about what's happening around the West on those issues. Thanks, Michael.
Awesome, thanks, David. Yeah, and Adrian, I assume we're getting, so presentation coming up shortly, but yeah, I'm Michael Dax, Western Program Director for Wildlands Network, based here in Santa Fe, but also working across Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. And so my presentation today is mostly going to focus on legislative efforts that are taking place in other Western states, some of which are kind of following New Mexico, some of which could potentially be inspiration for us here in New Mexico. And you could go to the next slide there, Adrian. And in case anyone has forgotten what's gone on here in New Mexico, here's just a quick recap. Yesterday, I think Mark Watson mentioned some of those memorials that Mimi Stewart sponsored prior to the Wildlife Corridors Act. So you have one HRM in 2003, and then the 2011, there was also additional memorials in 2009 and 2013 before the Wildlife Corridors Act in 2019. And as has been mentioned, $2 million appropriated from the general fund to implement the Wildlife Corridors Act. So I think, one thing to note there that, we'll see is a little bit different in other states, same as other, same as others, different from others, is that isn't dedicated to specific crossings or specific projects, but it is for the implementation of the act, so that DOT and Game and Fish together have that flexibility to put that money on the ground as they see fit. Maybe it's planning and design, maybe it's actual construction. So that's kind of one model that might be similar or different going forward from what other states have done. Next slide. All right, Colorado. I won't spend too much time. I think Tony is going to cover a lot of what's happened as far as on the ground in Colorado. But after a similar conference in 2017, the Colorado Wildlife Transportation Alliance was formed in 2018. Tabor Ward, I believe, covered a lot of that yesterday in her presentation. And then there's a
West Slope prioritization study that was completed in 2019. The East Slope prioritization study is going to be finished later this year. In principle, very similar to our wildlife corridors action plan as far as identifying hotspots and places where migratory corridors overlap with those hotspots and where wildlife crossings need to be built. And then in 2019, I believe it was July or August 2019, following our Wildlife Corridors Act, Governor Polis issued an executive order on connectivity, which then spurred the Big Game Winter Range and Migration Corridors report that CPW put out in 2020. And that was a very scientific technical report compiling data that CPW had gathered through GPS collars and other means over those years. And next slide. Then last year, last legislative session, there was a memorial passed unanimously by Colorado's legislature. So at that point, Colorado's legislature had not weighed in on corridors or connectivity issues. You had that strong indication of support from the governor. And so really that memorial there was kind of saying, yes, you know, kind of an indication of really strong support from the legislature leading up to our current campaign that I'll get to in a moment. And then in September 2021, Department of Natural Resources and CPW issued this big game policy report. And if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, it is really an incredible document that has all sorts of different policy ideas that would be fully applicable here in New Mexico. Everything from looking at recreation and agriculture to crossings to, you know, different ways that you know, through oil and gas regulation or other ways that corridors and connectivity principles could be incorporated into various levels of state government planning. And so that document will now be the blueprint for a lot of the work that we will be focusing on in, you know, probably a decade or more. I mean, the thing is exhaustive, and you know, it's inspiring and overwhelming all at once. Also, as last year, as part of the 2021 legislative session, there was money dedicated for a wildlife corridor coordinator at CPW. So right now here in New Mexico, we have that position at DOT, but we do not have that position at Game and Fish. You know, Mark Watson has, you know, certainly been that role in many ways. Theoretically, Mark would like to retire one day, and we'd like to ensure that that work continues through, you know, a position that's really dedicated and focused, through a job description. So right now Colorado is still in this legislative session. I know for us here in New Mexico, the legislative session seems like a distant memory, but in other states they meet for longer than 30 days. Weird, right? So Colorado is still going. In CPW's budget is money for 8 FTEs, 8 regional positions who would be leading implementation of that big game policy report. So not only just one position, and they do have that statewide position, but having 8 people in their 8 different regions who are in charge of implementing that big game policy report. If that money were to get through, if those positions are created and hired, that would indicate an enormous investment that would really put Colorado as a leader across the West. And then finally, Senator Jesse Danielson, who sponsored that resolution last year, currently introduced legislation, SB 151, to create a dedicated wildlife crossings fund. And that is a bipartisan bill. And right now it's $25 million that would go into that fund from the general fund. And that $25 million represents 20% of what would be needed to construct the 10-year priority list that CDOT has compiled. So thinking about those federal funds that are out there, usually matching at an 80-20 rate, that's how we got to that 20% number, that $25 million. And obviously, if that did get through, that would be really huge for Colorado. And one of the sponsors is the chair or vice chair? Chair of the Junior Budget Committee, Joint Budget Committee. in Colorado. So typically members of that committee do not sponsor legislation that's related to fiscal matters. So the fact that Representative McCluskey has decided to co-sponsor that bill is a strong indication that maybe not all $25 million will get through, but certainly a big chunk of money is likely to pass in Colorado. So definitely watch that as a good indication for New Mexico. And of course, right now with oil prices where they are, all signs point to the fact that our surplus should hopefully continue here in New Mexico, which means we'll be sitting at another historic surplus next year, in which case, numbers like this all of a sudden don't seem so big and scary. Next slide. Wyoming, in a lot of ways, Wyoming is definitely the leader when it comes to crossings and connectivity research. We heard from Matt Kaufman yesterday morning, and he gave a great presentation on all the collaring work that they've been doing. In 2020, Governor Gordon issued an executive order that designated 3 wildlife corridors and also created a process for other corridors to be designated in the future. As part of that, it also created local working groups and included directives to state agencies about how they should be incorporating connectivity and corridors principles in their different planning processes. But I think really the big message there is the designation of corridors. And I know that's something that we've all talked about in the past. It's kind of, thinking about 30 by 30, that would certainly be a new tool that does not currently exist for most of the country for us to consider. And then finally, for Wyoming, in 2005, they created the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resources Trust Fund that is focused on doing restoration work around the state. It's leveraged huge amounts of federal and private money. In this past legislative session, they included $75 million, or they invested an additional $75 million into that fund, part of which will be used for wildlife crossings work. So, here in New Mexico, there's been a lot of discussion around money for restoration, whether it's the Natural Heritage Conservation Act, a GEO bond, a trust fund. Again, with our surpluses, there's lots of capacity money floating around that we're not typically used to. In Wyoming, that trust fund has proved to be a really great model. And yeah, $10 million of that $75 million is earmarked for crossings. Next. Oh yes, and Wyoming's license plate. So so this has existed for 2.5 years. A wildlife conservation license plate. We currently have our share with wildlife license plate here in New Mexico that supports non-game research and habitat work. For this license plate, which is dedicated towards crossings, it's $180 application fee. I believe the share with wildlife plate might be like $25 or $30. So this is, significantly more money. But as a result, over the past 2.5 years, they've sold over 2,000, which has raised just under $500,000 specifically for wildlife crossings. And then you have Teton County, Wyoming, which is, certainly an anomaly across the West. That's where, Jackson Hole is. That's where Grand Teton National Park. It's the southern gateway for Yellowstone. Huge amounts of tourism, huge amounts of wildlife-based tourism. And a couple of years ago, they issued a special purpose excise tax of $10 million to support wildlife crossings. And last year, they allocated $3 million from that fund for 2 specific crossings. So, maybe not the perfect model for New Mexico to follow because we don't have tourism quite at that scale, especially, wildlife-based tourism. But the state, Governor Lujan Grisham has focused on our outdoor recreation economy and growing that sector of our economy. And I think as we continue to grow recreation here in New Mexico, it's important that we do so in a way that considers the impacts that industrial strength recreation has on wildlife. And something like this could potentially be instructive for how we mitigate those growing impacts. Next slide. All right, Utah. So 2020, Utah's House unanimously passed a resolution that was, more just an indication of support for wildlife connectivity principles. Since then, there's been a working group forum that's included nonprofits, Division of Wildlife Resources, UDOT, and other state agencies. And then this past year, Utah's legislature appropriated $1 million for a specific project at Echo Canyon at the I-80, I-84 interchange. So again, this, according to UDOT, this project is estimated to cost about $5 million. So that $1 million represents that 20% investment, hoping that there will be federal funding coming down the line to cover the rest of that project. And then Utah's legislature also unanimously passed HB 427, which would add wildlife mitigation to an annual report that UDOT submits to the legislature. So pretty much saying, what have you guys done? What are you planning to do around wildlife mitigation? So it's kind of, a very small step towards, a full action plan. But at least forces the agency to be thinking proactively about what steps it will be taking in the next year. All right, so California. So 2021 bill passed to encourage coordination between Caltrans and Colorado or California Division of Fish and Wildlife. Last year, California also appropriated more than $61 million for wildlife crossings. A large chunk of that money is being dedicated to the Liberty Canyon crossing, which many of you are probably familiar with, which is focused on facilitating connectivity of mountain lions in the LA region. And that's currently under construction. I believe that project is going to cost about $80 million. So that's like,
10 lanes of traffic.
10 lanes of traffic, and there also a frontage road. It's, it's kind of the mother of all wildlife crossings projects, but that is finally getting built. And that's the picture that you see there on the right. And then right now, introduced in California is the Safe Roads and Wildlife Protection Act, which requires Caltrans to implement at least 10 projects every year that improve wildlife connectivity. So that bill is still making its way through California's legislature, but if passed, that would be a huge commitment on part of California to implement these kind of solutions. That's Oregon. So right after New Mexico passed its Wildlife Corridors Act, Oregon passed a similar bill. Their Corridors Act, or their Corridors Action Plan, is due out at the end of 2022. And then just this past legislative session, Oregon allocated $7 million out of their general fund towards implementation. So right now, Oregon is the only state that in the West that has built fewer wildlife crossings than New Mexico. But with that $7 million, they might be trying to catch up with us. So now is the time for us to follow suit. Then Nevada. So last year, Nevada's governor issued an executive order on establishing the habitat conservation framework. One part of that was sagebrush habitat, big focus on sage grouse conservation, but the other leg of that was the wildlife connectivity plan. It gave Nevada DOT a larger role in habitat conservation. Management recommendations for migration corridors are directed NDOT and Nevada's Wildlife Department to develop those management recommendations, as well as best management practices for government planning around connectivity and corridor principles. So another example of an executive order giving those agencies strong direction around increasing their planning and protections of connectivity. So quickly, two other states, New Hampshire and Virginia, both passed bills that require development of wildlife corridors action plans, both of which will be due out at the end of 2022. So I think we think of these issues as being distinctly Western issues. But eastern states are getting in the game too, maybe not as much on the specific corridors front and, kind of seasonal migrations, but certainly lots of wildlife. Vehicle collisions are still an issue there. Virginia is also in the process of trying to establish a corridors crossing fund. They had $5 million in the budget this year that ended up getting struck, but those efforts are in full swing and being made by eastern states as well. And I think that will be it. But yeah, so I think the overarching conclusion is that New Mexico, in many ways, with our action plan, is in a great position to take advantage of federal funds. We've gone through that process, but there are other states that are leading in other ways, and I think we've all kind of come to the conclusion that funding is the big piece of the puzzle that we haven't yet cracked. And being able to ensure maximum coordination to both receive and put that funding on the ground is what we all really need to do.
Great, thank you, Michael. That was an excellent presentation. I just had one small amendment. In Wyoming, there was an additional $10 million that was appropriated for wildlife crossings in addition to that $75 million that was given to the Natural Resource and Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust Fund. So great things happening around the West and really good progress that we're seeing. So next I want to pass the torch to Jeff Gagnon, and I know he is a statewide connectivity biologist with the Arizona Game and Fish Department and was also very helpful with New Mexico's formulation of their wildlife corridors action plan that was recently released. And I think he's going to show what Arizona's been up to over the past several years in this space. So thank you, Jeff.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? A little louder? Okay. Try to get closer here. That better? Okay, cool. Okay. I don't want to drive Adrian nuts with my changing slides, so I'm going to take care of that on my end. So one of the things I wanted to talk about was some of the collaborations, and I was asked to talk about some of the cost efficiency approaches just based on what we've learned in Arizona. And some of you might be wondering why Arizona or why I've been so involved with a lot of New Mexico stuff. And what it comes down to is Arizona was really heavily involved with connectivity and roadkill mitigation. Pretty much about 2000, we got pretty heavy into it, and we're had quite a few projects going. We learned a lot, learned from a lot of mistakes too. And through that process, we formed a dedicated staff, which I'm the lead on, where we have a wildlife connectivity group within Arizona Game and Fish Department. At some point, it has up to as many as 7 or 8 staff working specifically on wildlife connectivity and corridors and so on and so forth. And so it's what we've learned. We have the resources to be able to work with other states around us to not only help, advance the science, but to also collaborate and bring back information to Arizona that's helpful to us as well. So one of our goals is to try to, basically knowledge share and collaborate with our neighboring states. And we've had the ability to collaborate in some way or another with all the states that touch Arizona from a wildlife connectivity standpoint. And so I'm going to go over some of that and the examples here, and I'm going to get into some of the cost efficiency stuff talking about, and then just a little touch on what Arizona's got going on, and there's a video I wanted to show at the end of it. So one of the things, you might have seen this diagram I created a while back in the action plan, in the New Mexico action plan. Basically, the idea is when we do these projects and we design them, there's always going to be some room for improvement, and being able to take what we learn from monitoring and research and additional studies and bringing it back into the next project help us keep us from reinventing the wheel. And this has been a very important process in some of the stuff we're doing on multiple levels. And so it's important from New Mexico's standpoint as they're moving forward is to make sure to really, utilize the resources rather than like you are. This summit itself is doing that. And so I think it's good that's a good way to handle this. And so being able to not, like I said, not reinvent the wheel. So an example I wanted to share where this approach, this iterative approach of learning and moving forward in Nevada, we're working with the Nevada Department of Transportation and Nevada Department of Wildlife on the Bighorn Sheep Project. And so quite a while back in basically the late 2000s, we were working on some projects to where we were looking at Bighorn sheep overpasses, Bighorn sheep crossings. We had some earlier work with underpasses that sheep weren't using the underpasses. And so we were trying to mitigate the impact of the highway that was being upgraded in northwestern Arizona. So we used GPS collars to help us identify where where we needed to put in wildlife crossings. And so 2000, 2010, 2011, based on that GPS data, we were able to identify 3 locations for wildlife overpasses. So here's kind of a bird's eye view of one of those wildlife overpasses. And then here's I guess a sheep's eye view of one of those also. So there's 3 of these up near Hoover Dam that have been in for more than a decade now. And, right up, we found after seeing sheep not use the underpasses on another highway, within the first 4 years, we had over 6,000 sheep crossings at these overpasses, helping us understand that, sheep really kind of like being up high, like overpasses better. So it's just some of these tidbits of information that helps all of us learn and be able to move forward. Here's an example of a video we have. Let's see if this will go. Yeah, you can see this lamb that's behind the U there just dropped probably a couple minutes ago. Not much beyond that. So making a big impact there. And if you look here at this graph, this is basically just the use of overpasses, the use of underpasses and culverts for bighorn sheep. So, I mean, that's a pretty telling graph that overpasses probably work better for bighorn sheep. But I do have an example later that gets you to thinking a little bit. So in the first year, we didn't have a ton of use. The success rate or the number of animals that approaches overpasses started out low, but then by years 3 and 4, we had almost 100% success rate at those. So again, there's a learning curve, and I'm not really getting into monitoring. I always get into monitoring quite a bit, but one thing is the long-term monitoring, very important in understanding how well these work. Because if you only did a year of research, you might find that this, you might not get the same results. And this is a good example of that. And so along that project, we were able to, in the first year, we really only reduced the accidents of bighorn sheep by about 50% from the historic average. So we had to do some modifications. Long-term monitoring helped us locate, basically, for lack of a better word, faults in our design and implementation, and we were able to improve that. In this graph right here, you see the last accident with bighorn sheep in that area was 2014. This is an old, this is now 2022, and we still haven't had an accident with bighorn sheep in this area. So we've been able to improve on that quite a bit. And so we were able to take this knowledge and work, collaborate with our Nevada partners, go across the river, across Hoover Dam over to the Nevada side, where I-11 Boulder City Bypass Phase 2, part of the I-11 corridor, which pretty much is planned to run from Mexico to Canada, new stretch of highway going through relatively pristine bighorn sheep habitat east of Boulder City with brand new roads. There's a lot of challenges that come with that. So New Mexico Department of Transportation, New Mexico Department of Wildlife, because they're one that they also have limited resources. We talked about some of that with, Mark Watson being the one-man show over here and some of this stuff. And so they asked for our input and help on this. And so we were able to help oversee some of the design and implementation of this project. And so you can see Lake Mead in the background there. And this is an overpass that we helped with the locating and designing of for that project. It's combined with several other underpasses, like the underpass there, which is a really large underpass, kind of a continuation of the habitat. We also use what we learned from our escape ramps, where animals are supposed to get out of the highway but not back in, and sheep find a way to get back in. So we learned a lot of lessons from that. And then some cattle guards, and we were able to implement this on the Nevada side. And so far, well, these are actually updated numbers, but as of a few months back, we had over 15,000 crossings already on this project. And we've learned a lot about, as those underpasses get to be massive, some of these underpasses become useful because they're just a continuation of the habitat. So the size of those can impact that. We also have quite a few sheep collars. We're looking at before, during, and after movements of sheep across this new highway through sheep habitat, and we have not had a collision with a sheep yet. So that's knock on something here, but yeah. So it's been a very positive collaboration with Nevada on this. And so we also, so basically we found that this project is so far maintaining habitat connectivity, no sheep vehicle collisions yet, and we've continued to gain from this information and pass it forward to the folks that are interested in learning from some of these collaborations. And so getting into New Mexico, collaborations continued. You see there's a report on determining the effectiveness of wildlife vehicle collision mitigation projects phase 1. You see Arizona Game and Fish is the main author on that. And this is a New Mexico project. It's the same deal, being able to utilize our resources to work with New Mexico Department of Transportation and New Mexico Game and Fish Department to be able to work on this. And so ECHO at 2013, which is the International Conference on Ecology and Transportation, some members of New Mexico Department of Transportation, New Mexico Department of Transportation approached us and asked if we could collaborate with them. And that's kind of where this took off from. And so some of the projects have been mentioned on a few occasions. This is a map of some of those projects. And we've been able to work with New Mexico to monitor quite a few of these. In the phase 1 project, these are the ones outlined in red. We were able to go back and start monitoring effectiveness of these structures. Some of these have been in for a while, some of them are relatively new. And so our main focus areas for phase 1 were in the Aztec, Cuba, Tijeras, and Gagnon area. And we found quite a lot of animals using these structures. And these are retrofits. And I talk about retrofits. Patty Kramer mentioned it yesterday. When you take a large culvert or bridge and you tie fencing into it and using it as a de facto wildlife crossing. And so most of these projects, except for Aztec, are retrofits. And so you can see the different wildlife that are using these. For our phase 1 project showed 14,242 crossings by various wildlife species. You see the list of wildlife species there. 12,000 mule deer. So from a safety perspective, also there's a big benefit here. And the Tijeras Canyon project, you'll see that in your field trip, your virtual field trip today, and you can kind of see some of the stuff that's going on there and better understand how these retrofits are being beneficial to wildlife here in New Mexico. And they work pretty well until hoodlums like this show up. This is Mark Watson. He likes to disguise himself as a good photographer. And then there's Jim Hirsch, who's been involved with a lot of these projects, and he likes to disguise himself as a worker. Don't let him fool you. They're causing their own set of problems. In fact, Jim likes to try to make the numbers inflate, so he climbs around. We're on to him though, making sure that those don't count as deer crossing. That's not part of my 12,000. We figured that out. And then Mark Watson likes to try to steal my stuff and show it to me. He stole my iPad one time and get pretty brave. So we had to do something about that one time. So we came in and took care of that problem. I think he's out now. He's in the back room. Yeah. So that the wildlife effectiveness of wildlife vehicle collision projects phase 1. If you go to the wildlife action plan and you look in there, you'll find some additional resources, and you'll find that report. Anybody that's interested in looking at that report a little bit more, it's on that link. Our phase 2 study, working with New Mexico, adds some game guard projects to Aztec, where deer are getting on the road. Project of Raton Pass, Chicory Creek, and Cuba detection system. Here's a couple of examples of those. We're monitoring that bridge in the upper left, and then Raton Pass has been mentioned before. We're going to continue to monitor that for quite a few years to see how animals adapt to that. Also, there's a animal detection system on Cuba 550 that we're fine-tuning on the stages on that one, and it's to warn motorists at the end of the fences on the Cuba project that there's animals in the road. And so I'll give you an example of a deer in the thermal detection system. When all these, you'll see the letters, the T's, that means true. So it's identified the target as a deer, lights up the box, and then it turns on some signs to warn motorists that there are animals on or near the road. So that's kind of an example of how that system works. We have one in Arizona. We've had it since 2007, and it's been pretty effective. So this one's well on its way to being there, I believe. We also have working on a motorist response system to see how people would react to these systems. And you'll see here that truck right there. is about to turn into the detection system, and you'll see the signs on the wildlife flashing coming on. So it allows us to see if brake lights, people are putting on their brakes or not, and how they're reacting. We're also monitoring speeds, stuff like that. And so that's pretty state-of-the-art project that New Mexico is working on there. Also, as you'll notice, a few of my team's names on the Wildlife Corridors Action Plan. We're involved with a lot of this process as well. So it's just that integrating and collaboration of working together to be able to advance the science, like I said. So sometimes I feel like Arizona got right out of the gates and starting to slow down, and New Mexico is coming along. They've been doing a lot of projects, and I can see the momentum coming here from New Mexico. So it's really kind of neat to be part of this process, and there's a lot of passionate people in New Mexico that when it comes to wildlife crossing, so it's a neat process to be involved with. So some of the cost efficiency I'll touch on real quick, just from what I've seen and learned from Arizona and talking with other states. So you've got integrated projects versus standalone projects. When I say integrated, if the DOT is going to upgrade a road anyway, then you can add in wildlife crossing components for a lot cheaper than you can do standalone projects in some cases. And so basically, here's what those costs look like. If obviously you do nothing, it doesn't cost you anything. But if you do retrofits, it's pretty inexpensive. But New Mexico's done a really good job of taking a lot of the opportunities that are available for retrofits and taking advantage of this. Now you start getting integrated projects and standalone, the price can go up substantially when you start getting into standalone projects. So, for example, these are some numbers. The numbers I was given from ADOT when we did the 3 overpasses up top there back in 2010, 2011, $5.5 million for all 3. So that doesn't sound like a ton of money in that situation. The number I was given on this one was $1 million for this. These are integrated into projects, so the design is absorbed, the mobilization is absorbed. There's a lot of ways to stretch your dollars, and we just talked about the crossing in California. I just heard a 5th number today. I heard 80 million today. So I've seen that number change a lot, go up a lot. That's really, the difference is that's really a standalone project. It's a very complex project. There's a lot of things that you can't compare these numbers apples to apples, but one thing to consider is you can gain a lot of ground. You can stretch your dollars if you're able to integrate some of these projects. Again, the standalone versus inclusive. The design of the structures, obviously, the more grandiose the structure is, the more it's going to cost. Fence is another one. I've seen numbers for fence at $11 a linear foot to $168 a linear foot for fence. That's $50,000 a mile or $900,000 a mile. That's a big difference. And so a lot of times those standalone projects, the fencing costs are quite a bit higher than the integrated project. So those are some of the things to keep in mind as you're moving forward. And the thought of bigger is better, not always the case. I mean, in the case of, it depends on your situation. Pronghorn, they really need a large open structure. I mean, that's really what we've seen so far, what we've learned so far. I talked about bighorn sheep. These were some of the underpasses that we weren't getting a lot of crossings on. Well, this crossing in Nevada, they're using, that's a huge crossing. If we look real close, there's a bighorn sheep standing underneath that. It's collared bighorn sheep. You can barely see it, but that's a huge structure. And so in that case, bigger is better. But when you get to some of the other species, you may not need as grandiose of a structure. And if you can, in situations where deer will go under a highway through say a 50-foot wide culvert, you may not need to necessarily have a 200-foot wide overpass to do the same thing. And so there's sometimes some, discussions that have to happen there. But, some of these overpasses are meant to serve multiple species, more of a land bridge. So really just has to be taken into context on how you're approaching that particular situation and what's most appropriate for that idea. But being able to, in some instances, use cost-effective and simpler structures can get you further along in some cases and stretch those dollars. So just a consideration. Also, I call them urban versus rural considerations. So look at these structures in Raton. These are structures that quite a few deer and bears and other wildlife actually use these things to cross roads. They're not bothered at all by some of this stuff. So these urban deer, urban wildlife act different than rural. So you can take those considerations into play when you're doing some of this. And, you know, I haven't figured out the suburban deer. I think if you put a soccer field on the other side of the road, they might, you know, cross at that point. I don't know yet. But one of the things the RTA, Pima County, this is an example where it's stretching dollars. They implemented a 0.5-cent sales tax, and as part of that came out $45 million for wildlife crossing, wildlife connectivity came out of that 0.5-cent sales tax. So it was a pretty big deal for that neck of the woods. And this included our State Route 77 wildlife crossings. And these have been pretty effective. And there's several projects where that 45 million is being, so for example, on this project, ADOT was going to upgrade State Route 77 to 6 lanes anyway. And so RTA was able to fund the wildlife components of that. And so these as standalone projects would have been, even though they weren't necessarily cheap or expensive, they would have been a lot more had they not been integrated into some of these projects. And, you know, we're looking at, as part of our secretarial, one of our secretarial research projects, we're looking at the connectivity across that wildlife crossing, and it's been pretty effective as far as that goes. Again, a lot of species using those, and right now through RTA, we're looking at overpasses 5 and 6 to be constructed down in southern Arizona through some of these processes. So what's up in Arizona? Quick review on what we're doing. One of the things that we've done is we've identified 3 main wildlife crossing projects as funds become available through the infrastructure bill and other options. And these are those 3 projects: Interstate 17, I-40, and Lion Springs. And we made it a point to focus Arizona Game and Fish Department ourselves to focus on projects, because we get a lot of questions about what about this area, what about this area. We wanted to be able to answer consistently and not be detracted from what our top goals are right now. So these are those 3 projects. One of the things we took into consideration is we wanted to be able to align with ADOT and their safety concerns, because a lot of these projects on state highways, we can't do it without ADOT support. You know, you can go get the money, you can show up with it and say, here you go. If they're not supportive of it, you can give it back, because you really need to collaborate with them. And so, and also from the Forest Service standpoint, we're working on areas where, in this case, I mean, the landowners always, depends on where you're at, BLM could be anywhere. But in this case, the Forest Service is the key player from the landscape side of things. We want to align these missions so that we can all benefit from it. So, Matt, I threw this picture in just for you since you asked about it yesterday. But one of the things that keep in mind, and I haven't seen a lot of discussions of safety in a lot of these talks. It's kind of feel good connectivity, but there is a big safety component to a lot of this. And there's a lot of animals getting killed on the road. There's a lot of animals, there's a lot of people potentially, at risk in some of these accidents. And until Glenn Harper showed some pictures yesterday, we weren't really touching on this side of it very much. But one of the areas where, working on Interstate 17, we have quite a few accidents. These high-speed roads, when people hit animals on high-speed roads, it causes a lot of havoc. And basically, along I-17, one stretch of I-17, we lose as many as 85 elk a year, 20 deer a year on one stretch, 30-mile stretch of road. That said, we also have a huge barrier. The animals that most of the animals don't cross, this is the collared animals on I-17, most of the animals that don't cross, of the animals that do cross, we see a lot of collisions still. So there's 2 problems there. You've got connectivity and a safety problem. So these are things that can help meet a lot of needs. And on I-17, we have a wildlife accident reduction report that was completed along with the design concept report. But again, funding, we always talk about funding. A lot of this stuff goes to the wayside because of funding. But in that process, we identified 2 wildlife overpass locations. This is one of them, to give you an example of what that might look like. There's another one, but it all kind of looks the same. Along I-40, one of our other priorities, milepost 173 is our highest elk vehicle collision, or our highest wildlife vehicle collision spot on I-40 west of Flagstaff. This is an accident probably a few years ago. 9 elk were killed, flipped over a couple semis, pretty serious stuff. And this was the worst accident I had seen until Tuesday. We lost 10 elk in one accident. And so this is kind of really a reminder of what's going on. This stuff that people need to know. This isn't just connectivity. There's a lot to this. Again, most of those elk aren't crossing the road, but of the ones that are, they're a safety concern, and we're losing a lot of animals. Another thing on this one that works well, this is part of our secretarial order, Grand Canyon to Prescott corridor. There's one major overpass that can connect these animals from the Grand Canyon all the way to Prescott. And this is the area where we want to implement our elk crossing, but it also benefits pronghorn. These are pronghorn elk crossing locations that are coming right up to the road, both sides of the road. And we can take a pronghorn herd that we haven't documented crossing on in decades. I don't even know if the last crossing was documented on I-40, and connect that herd and bring them back down. It's a unique area where the railroad tracks are pulled away from there. There's just opportunities for animals to cross there. That overall project is, one overpass with about 4 miles of fencing. So we're looking at that. This is the east and westbound lanes, kind of a diagram of what that might look like. Lion Springs project, 0260. It's an area where we've learned a lot since 2000. A lot of underpasses in place. We used to use VCRs to figure out what was going on there, watch animal behavior, and see how they reacted. So we've learned a lot since this design concept report, which was dated 2000, only had one culvert in the middle of it. You can kind of see that hexagon there in the middle. And we learned that culverts don't work well for elk, and we learned that we need more than one culvert. And so we've added in an overpass and 2 underpasses to this project, working with ADOT. And so this is another one of our priorities right now. So as far as our corridors go, a lot of the secretarial stuff we're working on, but from a research standpoint, when Casey released the money to do research on, extend our research knowledge here, we jumped on that as quick as we could, and be more than happy to keep spending that for you, Casey. Just let us know when. So the secretarial order money along the I-11 corridor recommended alternatives. It's in some cases, a new highway through Arizona. So it could be a big thing for wildlife. It's a proposed project. It's nothing's certain yet, but they're working well along that way. So we collared quite a few deer along I-11 to try to, maintain these movement corridors that happen along the proposed corridor. For example, here's one of those where the orange line is the preferred corridor going through areas where we've identified crossings, so we can make recommendations on where to put wildlife crossings. Some of our stuff up on the peaks. This is one of our Flagstaff to Grand Canyon areas. We have pretty good, well-defined migration corridors for mule deer. There's this little creek called the Grand Canyon that keeps them from going any further. So, we're not going to have much longer than that, but these are still many, many miles, 80-mile migrations in some cases. We also have some of well, I should mention these models. If you saw Matt Kaufman's talk earlier, these are all migration mapper models that we're using for a lot of this information gathering as well. And you can find some of these models I'm showing you in the USGS reports that he, laid out earlier in the talk. So this is some of the pronghorn data that we're using for the migration mapper model and the data. It's a kickoff to some of the Northern Arizona Landscape Connectivity Alliance stuff that Leslie was mentioning earlier. So we're able to kind of utilize this stuff to work forward on doing some habitat restoration, corridor restoration, et cetera. So I'm going to go ahead and let Adrian cue a video that kind of touches on some of this stuff, and then I think that'll be it for me.
While we're waiting, does I-10 have any priorities?
Every year, animals.
In Arizona.
You asked if I-10 had any priorities
In
on it.
Arizona.
Right, not at the moment. I mean, we've talked about the sheep herd down on Steins in New Mexico. And so New Mexico has that priority that's also aligns with our sheep movement studies, but that's the one that comes to mind.
And I did have this conversation with Jeff recently about how many structures, wildlife crossings have been built in Arizona. And I know there's a little problem on how you quantify them, because some of them have been retrofits or involved in other projects. But he said there's at least probably 40 to 60 that are, dedicated to wildlife, and then maybe as much as 80 or something that you've built in the state.
Yeah, you got to really start when you dive into, like I said, what a crossing structure is. Some things that have been retrofit for smaller animals count. I mean, so it just depends on what you count as a wildlife crossing in that case. Okay.
Every year, animals cause an estimated 1 to 2 million car crashes in the United States. Those collisions result in expensive repairs, high insurance premiums, human injuries, and a high number of human fatalities. In some of the worst states for animal collisions, there are about 19 deaths for every 1 million registered vehicles. Fortunately, Arizona is considered a low-risk state for animal collisions. That's due in large part to the fact that for more than 20 years now, the Arizona Game and Fish Department has been working with ADOT and other partners to create safer roadways, while at the same time promoting wildlife movement across Arizona landscapes.
ADOT, their mission is to get people safely from point A to point B. Ours is to protect wildlife and so we have wildlife for our future generations. And so when you can work together with ADOT and you can make both things happen for the good, it's a win-win for everyone. The overpass is the first one in the Sonoran Desert, and so we're able to see how it works here, and combined with this underpass, which is one of a couple of underpasses in the Sonoran Desert, we're able to see how they work for the species that live in this ecosystem, and so far they work really well. To date, we have over 10,000 animals that have used these structures, and about 5,000 have used the overpass and about 5,000 have used the underpass. So having the two structures together has really solved the problem here with habitat fragmentation, and these animals seem to be readily adapting to the structures, and we're seeing over time the use increase. So it's been a really effective project for this situation.
The end goal really is to have healthy biological diversity in the Sonoran Desert, to save the desert and to save the wildlife that live here. Wildlife crossings help us do that.
Jessica Moreno is the Conservation Science Director for the Tucson's Coalition for Sonoran Desert Protection.
Whether it's wildlife camera trap data or roadkill data, or even wildlife sightings that people themselves turn in, all of that helps us not only show that it's working, but also show if maybe it isn't working and how we can make improvements next time. Every time we build a structure like this, a wildlife bridge or a wildlife underpass, it's an improvement on previous projects.
The data collected is crucial, especially when pre-planning for projects like the Oracle Wildlife Crossing. Data and partnerships are the key to future success.
If we want to move the needle towards wildlife connectivity and away from habitat fragmentation in any location and across the state as a whole, it's going to be only possible through partnerships among a diversity of groups. From land management to transportation agencies, it's going to take a whole myriad of partners to achieve a success like we had here in State Route 77.
The Arizona Department of Transportation has been an important partner with Game and Fish in achieving wildlife connectivity on roadway projects all over the state.
Some of the best projects that we've worked on with ADOT have been projects where there's been a new road going in or a reconstruction going in. In those cases, it's a lot easier for ADOT to put in wildlife crossings than take a road that's already existing and just put in a structure. So, when you're thinking about wildlife early on, it's easier to implement wildlife crossings into those projects. And this is State Route 77 is a good example of that.
Another good example of a successful interstate collaboration to create wildlife crossings is a 15-mile stretch of Interstate 11, 3 miles west of the Arizona-Nevada state line.
So we are standing above Interstate 11, a new section of roadway that goes right through the habitat of desert bighorn sheep.
When the Nevada Department of Transportation, the Regional Transportation Commission of Southern Nevada, and the Nevada Department of Wildlife began planning the Interstate 11 roadway, engineers and wildlife officials turned to the Arizona Game and Fish Department.
So Nevada, when they initially heard stories of us able to successfully build and monitor a structure, that was the impetus for them contacting us just to say, how did you go about that?
Chad Lohberger is one of the core members of the Arizona Game and Fish Department's highly acclaimed road ecology program.
This site was chosen is because it does connect two ridges, which are preferred by desert bighorn sheep. It puts them up high. They have high visibility to the surrounding area, And in this case, they have high visibility of the overpass structure, seeing that it's a safe place to cross the road, basically.
Game and Fish had a successful history with developing 3 wildlife crossings along Highway 93 back when ADOT first began construction between Kingman and the Arizona state line. Prior to that project, Game and Fish had worked first to capture and collar the bighorn and then monitored their GPS movement data. That eventually helped identify exactly where the bighorn were crossing along that 93 segment of highway. After tracking and monitoring for a couple of years, that information went into ADOT's planning of the new section of the 93 highway and led to the creation of those new wildlife crossings. The result was a dramatic reduction in bighorn vehicle collisions and a change in the way engineers and builders thought about wildlife fragmentation and connectivity.
We were able to work with them and say, if you are going to put together a package that you're going to send out to contractors and say, please bid on this project, it would behoove you to put in these stipulations related, in this case, desert bighorn sheeps, and the monitoring of those structures. So the contractor knows you should count on building this when you build this roadway.
In the beginning, I was one of those folks, like, seriously, we're creating a bridge for sheep. Does that really, like, in what world does that make sense? But the reality is that in every world that makes sense. Like, the importance of that cannot be overstated.
I mean, when I went to the first meeting and we were meeting with Arizona Game and Fish, we were like, it was kind of a head scratcher, but once we saw what you guys have done and the, you know, the ideas that you brought for the roadways, it was great and it really worked out.
If we want to keep animals connected to the resources they use, we can now make informed decisions to inform that development process.
The vision that Arizona Game and Fish had and their expectation of what they were looking for, it was correct and it worked.
It's really heartwarming to see that they're working, and also to see through these cameras that the wildlife are here. So even though we're home in our living rooms and we're totally unaware that right outside our back doors, animals are moving and thriving, it's kind of special.
Great. Thank you. And in an amendment to my earlier comment, I think I'm going to make this a half an hour so that Tony has the time he needs to get through his great presentation. It's my great pleasure to introduce Tony Cady. Hard for me to say enough good about this human. He is such a leader on these issues in Colorado. He's the Region 5 Environmental Program Manager, I believe, is that something like that, for the Colorado Department of Transportation. Also a prime mover with the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance. As much of an advocate as he is a planning and design guru with these structures. But Tony, I want to turn it over to you and take your time, and we'll definitely entertain some questions after this. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Yeah, so as David mentioned, I work for the Colorado Department of Transportation. Hopefully you guys can see my screen. Yeah, okay. So I'm the Environmental and Planning Manager for the Southwest part of the state. And I'm also one of the chairs for the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance that David, Michael, and Tabor have mentioned before. And I want to talk a little bit about that process and what that means for Colorado. Specifically, I want to talk about the momentum that's been growing in Colorado over the past decade or so to conserve our big game populations, really through wildlife vehicle collision reduction efforts, but also in big game migration route protection and preservation. And really the point of this presentation that's been expressed by many of the presenters at this summit, it's really about successful collaboration And you can't make a lot of headway on these things without really great solid partnerships and collaborating with multiple stakeholders. So before I get into what we're doing about the issue of wildlife vehicle collisions and habitat connectivity stuff, I wanted to provide a little context on the problem. I know people have touched on this, but in Colorado, we're seeing a huge economic issue that's helping to elevate this in a lot of people's minds. Like New Mexico, Arizona, CDOT, Colorado has a massive transportation system. We have operate 23,000 lane miles of highway. Colorado is also home to several of the largest herds of elk and mule deer in the United States, and that situation creates a significant amount of conflict on our roadways. Our maintenance forces record every instance of roadkill that needs to be addressed in their day-to-day activities, and that data shows that they remove about 6,000 animal carcasses from our roadway every year. And then Colorado State Patrol data shows that there are around 4,000 reported wildlife vehicle collisions every year. We believe that, a conservative estimate is that roughly half of all motorist conflict with animals is not reported or seen. And so we're likely seeing around 14,000 animals struck and killed on our state highway system every year. It's also really important to note that 2% of Colorado's deer and elk are killed by wildlife vehicle collisions, which exceeds the total number of animals that are harvested each year through hunting without the benefits that hunting provides the state. In fact, wildlife vehicle collisions create a huge economic impact to our economy, like I mentioned. Research has shown that the economic value of a single deer to Colorado is around $2,000, and that of a single elk is around $2,400. So the total economic value of wildlife lost to wildlife vehicle collisions is estimated at around $24 million annually. And then when we factor in the financial cost to motorists from property damage, medical expenses, traffic delays, all of those things that we've been mentioning, the total economic impact from wildlife vehicle collisions to Colorado's economy is around $75 million every year. Okay, so what has Colorado been doing about the problem? Well, we've grown in our response to the rising rates of wildlife vehicle collisions like many of the other Western states. And so has our investment in mitigating the impact that our roadways have on the landscape. Work to address wildlife vehicle collisions really began in Colorado in the 1970s. And over the next several decades, this work continued in a really sporadic fashion with various improvements across the state, but really focused on a project by project basis without a lot of cohesivity to the plan. But importantly, we conducted a lot of monitoring on those efforts to determine which techniques were effective at allowing for highway permeability and then reducing animal mortality on our roadways. Seeing how beneficial monitoring results are to the implementation of effective mitigation measures, Colorado really ramped up our research program in the early 2000s. And here's some examples of the research efforts that were conducted. And it really broadened our focus from solely the safety aspects of mitigation design to a broader look at habitat connectivity considerations and animal movement needs tied to effective crossing locations along the highway system. So as CDOT and CPW developed their research programs and collaborated on research projects, so too did the overall state of the science of road ecology and the growing body of information around habitat connectivity and highway permeability. Another really important milestone in Colorado that several folks have mentioned was the release of the Colorado Western Slope Mule Deer Strategy in 2014. This study was conducted to find a way to address a 35% decline in the state's mule deer population that had been documented between 2006 and 2013. And within that strategy, one of the main issues that CPW was directed to focus on was reducing the impacts of highways on mule deer and elk survival and addressing big game movement needs and migration relative to the state highway system. So really directing DNR, the Division of Natural Resources, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife to work with the DOT to solve some of the issues that we were seeing. As others have mentioned, in 2015, CDOT and CPW really began collaborating and finding ways to better coordinate wildlife considerations into our planning and project delivery process. And in 2016, we developed a funding and data sharing agreement, and then we dedicated staff to a study panel hired a research team, and then initiated the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study that Michael just mentioned earlier this morning's session. The study was primarily funded by CDOT with some financial contribution from CPW, but they provided a ton of staff time and then provided access and analysis of data that was really critical to that study. The study was conducted primarily by Julia Kinch with Echo Resolutions and Pat Bastings with Jacobs Engineering. And we focused mainly on the western part of the state to begin with, because Colorado's western slope accounts for 60% of all the reported wildlife vehicle collision accidents in the state. And then studies show that roads with average annual daily traffic of 9,000 cars a day or more create an almost permanent barrier to wildlife movements. And many of the roadways in western Colorado were just getting near that threshold. So due to the importance of the issue, we chose to partner on this particular project, recognizing the need to develop a strategic and proactive approach to addressing wildlife vehicle collisions, and also to improve habitat connectivity. And it would really be an improvement on that project by project review that was lending itself to those sporadic improvements that we had seen in the past within Colorado. And CDOT really saw the need for a prioritized list of highway segments that could be directly integrated into our project planning, budgeting, and design process. So we were addressing these needs early on in the process and identifying the funding required to build the mitigation measures that we wanted to do, and therefore seeing the greatest impact to our system. So the objective of the study was to conduct an analysis of mule deer and elk conflict areas relative to the entire state highway infrastructure across the western part of the state. And our primary concern, as Jeff just mentioned, was really around safety for the traveling public. CPW's primary objective was to ensure the long-term health of the wildlife populations that they manage, mainly by reducing highway mortality. The goals of the study were to identify those high wildlife conflict areas across the western part of the state, both in our current state population levels and travel patterns, and under a future growth scenario and the new travel demand created by that growth. And then we wanted to identify where mitigation funding should be placed to achieve the greatest benefit to the state, and then provide a mechanism to integrate those into our planning processes. This is a data-driven prioritization process utilizing risk models for both current and future growth and travel demand. We looked at the magnitude of winter range use, magnitude of migration, and data specific to wildlife vehicle collisions and other safety data that really allowed us to determine the highway segments in the greatest need of mitigation. And then we analyzed every half-mile segment of every highway on the western part of the state, and then looked at the data to develop an overall prioritization of needs. So this map shows the overall criteria and prioritization on the western part of the state, with the segments in red being the top 10% sites with the greatest need for mitigation, both to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions or to allow for wildlife movement, whether we'd seen collisions at those locations or not. And these red sites represent the areas that CDOT and CPW are focusing on for our immediate improvement for investments for infrastructure. So Tabor mentioned this a little bit, Michael mentioned it. We've developed a lot of partnerships with CPW and the Division of Natural Resources in Colorado. And another one that I wanted to talk about was this Wildlife and Transportation Summit that we hosted in 2007, which really kicked off a huge spurt of data sharing, staff time sharing, a lot of meetings between CDOT and CPW to really focus on wildlife vehicle collision reduction and getting the department to really look more at habitat connectivity issues. So the two-day summit was established, co-hosted by CDOT and CPW. And the aim was really to create partnerships and develop an action plan to improve highway safety, but also to conserve wildlife populations and their movement corridors, mainly through the implementation of highway crossings or other mitigation features. So a lot of the conversation that was had during the meeting was around that 2014 CPW mule deer strategy, and then around the outcomes that we were seeing from the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study that had been kicked off in 2016. It was kind of in mid-process by the time we held the summit. And then we also talked about some of the successful projects that we delivered across the state and the monitoring results that we've seen, really to express to folks, both agency staff and our stakeholders, how effective these types of mitigations are to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions and to ensure highway permeability and habitat connectivity. One of the big takeaways from that event was the knowledge of how critical it is to have a multi-agency collaboration to help address, the wide-ranging and really complex issues that we're seeing in Colorado and just across the West in general. And then the summit concluded with the development of a very defined action plan that would allow the state to continue to address wildlife vehicle collisions and habitat connectivity issues across the state. We also formally recognized the need for a steering committee that would help advance the initiative by implementing strategy and then prioritizing areas for a group to focus on. And so at the conclusion of the summit, the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance was formally created and established as a statewide coalition between CDOT, DNR, CPW, and then several federal land management agency partners, tribal partners, academic groups, nonprofit groups, and biologist and engineering partners as well, to really get a well-rounded perspective of the issues in Colorado. The Alliance adopted a mission, which is to provide safe passage for people and wildlife, and along with a vision for us to really operate towards. And one of the visions was really for us to be inclusive of a variety of stakeholders, both agency and NGO staff, which I think we've done a really good job incorporating multiple points of view and multiple stakeholder groups to bring their input and information to the Alliance. So in the background, I'm going to jump ahead to 2019, but in the background between 2017 and 2019, the Alliance has been working in Colorado, really educating the public, going to a ton of public meetings, both CDOT, CPW led presentations or tables, booths at conferences to really talk about the Alliance, to educate the public about the need for funding for wildlife crossing structures and to really educate folks on how effective these mitigation strategies are. We've also really brought a lot of strength to going after competitive grants, and we've been successful in delivering money through the NIFWIF program or other programs of that nature to help fund wildlife crossing improvements across the state. In 2019, as folks have mentioned, Governor Polis issued his executive order 2019-011, and that provided direction and oversight to Colorado agencies really to continue their collaborative efforts to address wildlife vehicle collisions and habitat connectivity issues across the state. And it really provided direction in four main ways. One, it directed DNR to compile a status report of Colorado's big game and migration patterns and seasonal habitats. And that was delivered in 2020. It also directed DNR and CDOT to partner on a report to identify policy, regulation, and legislative opportunities to ensure conservation of seasonal big game habitat migration corridors, with an emphasis of having us include the implementation of crossings and other mitigation projects, and then incorporating those needs into the planning process. And as Michael mentioned, that was released in 2021. It also directed CDOT and CPW to develop and sign a MOU, or a memorandum of understanding, that outlines and defines the expectation for those two agencies to collaborate on moving into the future. And that was recently signed by both agencies. And then lastly, it formally recognized the role of the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance as a statewide coalition that CDOT and CPW need to support and work with on habitat connectivity and wildlife vehicle collision reduction issues across the state. So really cemented the role of the Alliance within the processes that were going on at a statewide level. And then moving ahead to 2021, as Michael mentioned, the legislature issued a unanimous joint resolution supporting the EO that Governor Polis had released several years before, and it supported all the mandates within that EO. It provided support for the Colorado Wildlife and Transportation Alliance. It supported both CDOT and CPW's efforts to prioritize wildlife mitigation and habitat connectivity efforts, and focused a lot of the language on project delivery and project planning processes, really bringing CDOT into the process and making sure that we're planning ahead for these types of needs across the state. This year, Senate Bill 151 has been introduced that would provide $25 million from our statewide budget to help design and construct wildlife crossing structures around the state. And as David mentioned and Michael's mentioned, this money would be used to get projects that we've identified as top priorities within the state shovel ready and ready to immediately access federal grant dollars. And then it would provide that statewide match for federal dollars through these grant programs that Renee went over yesterday. A lot of opportunities out there, and this money would allow us to immediately capitalize on those opportunities. And as David mentioned, we have a 10-year strategic plan within the state. And to explain the context of that within the transportation world, we operate on a 4-year statewide transportation improvement plan, which is kind of the commitments of the money that we're expecting to get over the next 4 years, the projects that we'll deliver in a 4-year time frame. And then we look out 25 years and we look at all the needs within the state and how we would potentially address those needs. But to bridge the gap between those two huge timeframes, we've developed a 10-year plan that if additional money became available, we would deliver these strategic priorities across the state. With the passage of Senate Bill 260 last year, that's a new fee structure in Colorado that will bring a lot of new money to the department. We have committed to delivering all the projects in our 10-year plan, while also seeking federal grant opportunities to help leverage the dollars within that plan. And we've identified 25 projects within that strategic plan that have very significant wildlife mitigation components as part of the scope of work that we're aiming to complete over that next 10-year period. And this map depicts the locations and the areas where those will be located. And those projects were selected using the priorities identified in the West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. And as I think Michael mentioned, we are completing the East Slope Prioritization Study right now. So we'll have a statewide prioritization model, which will allow us to identify all the priorities and then rank them with a benefit cost analysis tool that is also included within those documents. And I think that's it.
All right, round of applause for these. Great panel. Thank you, Tony. And as I said with Jeff, I think Colorado has a statewide map that maybe we can find the link to. 64 different wildlife crossing structures have been built in the state over the past, I guess, 4 or 5 decades. So doing really good work across the state. But let's have some questions, and I guess we'll do a similar way we did to last time. We'll turn on this microphone if folks want to come up and ask a question of any of these panelists. Or if we have online questions.
I have a question.
All right.
I have a question for Jeff and Tony. So Jeff, you mentioned that integrated projects are a lot cheaper. And typically I think what we've seen is that prior planned road construction, is what kicks it off. And then you look for any wildlife elements. Could it be possible that you have a wildlife project that then says, okay, are there any, road safety, other road improvement elements that we want to do first? So it's the wildlife component that's driving the integrated project, as opposed to road repairs or improvements that are kind of then seeking a wildlife component.
I think I'm going to let Tony answer that one. He probably has more of the connection on from the DOT side, but I've seen some almost parallel things, but not necessarily where the wildlife is driving that construction.
So great question. Jeff mentioned both in his presentation and the video that, the Department of Transportation has a very defined mission and vision, right? And really it's around moving goods and people effectively and efficiently and providing a safe transportation system. And so when we're selecting projects, we're usually looking for those improvements that are going to benefit our roadway users. And so that wildlife projects are usually selected based off of safety information, right? So we'll see a huge spike in accidents based off of a safety study that we've done, and then we analyze the nature of those accidents. Are they intersection related, kind of bumper to bumper accidents? Are they side swipes? Are they run off the road accidents? And in rural Colorado, those are typically wildlife vehicle collisions. So on many of the roads in Western Colorado, the primary crash type are wildlife vehicle collisions, with 60 to 70% of all the accidents being wildlife vehicle collisions. And that really drives the need for fencing, right, to keep them out of the roadway. And then we've adopted, based off of road ecology principles, that you can't install fencing without installing a way for animals to access critical habitats. So the comprehensive design includes fencing, an underpass or an overpass, and treatments at the end of the fence, jump outs, and then cattle guards at all the accesses, right? So it's kind of a systematic approach to addressing that safety issue. Now that we've been working with CPW much more closely, we have an annual meeting with them where we talk about the projects we want to build in the next 4 to 6 years. They're able to identify issues that we may not be seeing with the accident or the carcass removal data, which really tells us where we're seeing those hot spots on the road. We've got a West Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study. We'll have an East Slope Wildlife Prioritization Study that identifies needs, and those are all mapped. And CPW is pointing us in the direction of where needs are and where we're going to have projects where we're going to be constructing improvements, and maybe we should be considering adding wildlife mitigation components. One of the tools that we created in Colorado this last year is a map that basically shows all of the West Slope and East Slope priorities, and then all of the projects that CDOT's going to build over the next 10 years. And that could be just a straight up overlay or a chip seal project. But if it's going over a top 10% site, that's an opportunity for us to do what Jeff said, which is to leverage the mobilization costs, the design costs, the traffic control, and the environmental mitigation that is required to incorporate another project component, which would be wildlife mitigation within that design and construction of that project to make it cheaper. And then it's on us, it's on the Alliance and the regional kind of environmental managers and planning managers to go out and find the funds, if they weren't identified initially, to help us incorporate the financing into the project to deliver those mitigation components. So it kind of goes both ways.
Great, thank you, Tony. We have one question from an online, from Renee Callahan actually, and she says, wonderful presentation on all of Colorado's great work. Love that CDOT has a 10-year plan that bridges the 4-year STIP and the 25-year long range transportation plan. It's a fantastic best practice. And so I'm wondering if anyone is aware of this and other states doing this in the region, and also whether NMDOT might consider such a plan to be useful. Renee did not indicate who that was directed at. I guess in my work in the regions that I work in, I'm not aware of any other state that does it this way, although I think it is definitely a best practice. As Michael mentioned, there's some other states that do it quite a bit differently, such as California, which is a whole different beast of its own. But in that state, this legislation that Michael talked about from Wildlands Network this year that would help create a statewide prioritization process like we've seen in Colorado and other states in the region, like in New Mexico's just produced. But right now, the way it works is that community groups and grassroots are basically feeding projects up to the state level and then asking for funding. So it kind of works in reverse. The state's not currently maintaining a statewide priority list. And so I think this legislation is aimed at turning that around a little bit and helping streamline the process from the state side. So good question. Patty Kramer says, very few states do this. I've presented the CDOT 10-year model in my research with other states, and few, if any, do this. So yeah, I think it is a best practice, and one, great to have this summit and start sharing some of these ideas. I think this is the benefit to working across state boundaries and sharing success stories and things, tools that are working. So any other questions from me? Okay, Brittany, please.
Thank you, everybody. This question is for Jeff. I really enjoyed your presentation. And as somebody who works in the legislative budget space, I appreciated your cost breakdowns. One thing you didn't include on your cost slide, I don't think, was the heat sensing technology that you showed a video of, where it identified a deer and then that caused lights to go on the road. How much did those cost?
I'm trying to remember exactly how much that one cost. Mark, do you happen to remember? I think those are more cost effective. I mean, they're in the several $100,000 range versus wildlife crossings, but you have to keep in mind when you use them, there's certain situations where they're appropriate. You don't really want to put them on interstates where people are going, you know, really fast. I mean, we've seen our detection system in Arizona. The sign comes on, says out detected, and then people stop and start looking for it and they want to take pictures of it, and that's a whole other issue itself. So it's a really very specific tool that you'll find, you know, mention of it here and there in the action plan. It's a developing technology. It's something we need to look towards in the future for some of the mitigation, but it shouldn't be something that's leaned on as kind of a heavy lift for some of the projects. Mark?
Actually, Jeff, we did get a cost estimate from It's works to replace the detection system at Tijeras. It's about.
Okay, well, Mark was just saying that a replacement of the Tijeras Canyon system would run about $500,000. Just to give you an idea what those types of things run.
And yesterday, Matt Kaufman talked about Eagle Mountain in Utah, and UDWR is pursuing that there. In the cost that I was told was $250,000. So not sure, you know, why there might be a discrepancy, but that's what, yeah. So
yeah,
perhaps in that range.
There are other components too. It depends on the signage. It depends on, you know, there's thermal versus radar type systems. There's also electrified guards or cattle guards sometimes used to keep animals from going up. So it's just a combination of things. It depends on the situation.
And our costs also include design.
And Mark Watson is saying that what was the cost again, Mark?
Well, about 400,000.
Okay, for the Tijeras Canyon animal detection system, it was about 400,000, but it also included design and planning budget in that.
For replacement of the existing.
Oh, for replacement of the existing system. There you go. Okay. Great. Well, I think we've used up our additional half an hour, and just want to thank all these panelists for their time today, and great session. Thank you.
Panelists. So now we're going to transition to getting the 27 Zoom participants and the approximately 26 in-person participants in our magic virtual van to do a trip to the Tijeras Canyon. So go ahead and sit down, put on your virtual seatbelts, and I think this is going to go off without a hitch.
So Jeff Gagnon recommended that we include a video that was shot by Laura Haskins, who's an environmental reporter with our local PBS television station, KNME. And that was a great idea. Thank you, Jeff. So we're going to start off with about a 5-minute video about the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Coalition.
We're here at New Mexico 333, and further behind me is I-40, and in between those two roadways is Tijeras Creek. And the wildlife, primarily mule deer, they come from the surrounding hillsides down across the roadway into Tijeras Creek to get water.
New Mexico 333 is part of the old Route 66, built in the 1930s.
Cars have advanced. Back in the 30s, vehicles were 10, 20 horsepower. Now we're dealing with 100 horsepower. So cars go much, much faster today than in the past. And so that creates problems.
That includes dangerous accidents when a driver hits a large animal like a deer or an elk.
just like us, they need water, food, and cover. And so sometimes for them to acquire those resources, they have to cross our roadways. Sometimes they cross at specific areas that cause problems for the traveling public. And wildlife vehicle collisions, it's a cost to the drivers, it's property damage to vehicles, and in some cases they injure drivers and actual fatalities to drivers.
On 333, the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Project uses fences and electrified barriers to funnel wildlife to cross in one particular spot. When animals like bears, deer, or elk cross here, they activate flashing lights that warn drivers to slow down.
These electrified barriers prevent the animals from going up the roadway and keeps them to cross the roadway perpendicularly. It won't impact normal pedestrians or bicyclists, but the electrified barriers, if somebody's walking their dog, the dog will receive a shock. So we have pedestrian push buttons that turn off these electrified barriers temporarily. The reason we don't just build game fence up and down the roadway is that we also want to provide crossings, habitat connectivity for wildlife so that wildlife can still have access to water, food, and cover. Just like humans, we use roadways to go to the supermarket. We need to allow some gaps in these game fences so that wildlife can meet their needs.
There are other strategies that can be used, like wildlife underpasses.
Right now, we are in what we call the East Underpass, below the easternmost bridge. That's part of the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage project. And we were just at the crosswalk before this, which is about a half a mile due east from here. And so when wildlife cross at the crosswalk to get water in their daily movements or longer dispersal movements to try to get to the manzanos, they can get water in Tijeras Arroyo when they cross the crosswalk and come down the arroyo and get under I-40 here. So the crosswalk essentially gets wildlife, mule deer, bears, cougars across Old Route 66 or New Mexico Highway 333. They can come down Tijeras Arroyo and move under the freeway at this location, at this bridge. And you can hear the heavy traffic of I-40 above us, so they can move safely below the freeway and not get hit.
Wildlife and community groups recognize Tijeras Canyon as an important place where animals are moving back and forth between the Sandia and Manzano Mountains. 15 years ago, a student group, Wild Friends, lobbied the state legislature to convene a workshop to look at wildlife driver accidents.
A lot of the folks that attended the original workshop lived on the east side of the Sandias and had hit deer or seen deer hit, seen carcasses in the road, and basically felt like it was a danger and it was unnecessary for these wildlife to be hit constantly on the highway. So we formed this Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Coalition that became the first and only advocacy group in New Mexico to really advocate with DOT and New Mexico Department of Game and Fish to implement a wildlife vehicle collision mitigation project.
Agencies can tell the project is working when they check the wildlife cameras and see deer, elk, bobcats, mountain lions, all sorts of animals using the passage. But people also need to change their own behavior to ensure people and wildlife are safe.
You need to be aware of that when you're driving and slow down. The only thing that really stops those accidents from occurring is when motorists slow down or are prepared to react. Like if they're at a wildlife crosswalk, like the one we have in Tijeras Canyon, and the animal detection system detects animals crossing and the light starts blinking, you need to slow down.
For New Mexico in Focus and Our Land, I'm Laura Paskus.
So now we're gonna
You remain stubborn.
or watch commercials. Now we're gonna watch a movie. No, I'm just kidding. Now we're gonna transition into a Google Earth view and try to start at like the 20,000 foot level and provide a little bit of ecological context to Tijeras Canyon, and then some point we'll zoom in and kind of show you where the crosswalk is and the project limits. So for those of you like out in the virtual audience that aren't from the Albuquerque, Santa Fe area, Tijeras Canyon is about a mile east of Albuquerque, and it's a big canyon basically with generally perennial water flow coming down Tijeras Arroyo that wildlife use. And it basically separates the Sandia Mountains to the north and the Manzano Mountains to the south. Old Route 66 came through the canyon back in the day. Now it's New Mexico Highway 333. And then in the 60s or so, the interstate was built. And, you know, that added to the habitat fragmentation of the area with huge traffic volumes, because I-40 is a major east-west transportation corridor for thousands of semis every day. And just for a little more context, Albuquerque is just west of Tijeras Canyon, and it's obviously a large city, 500,000 people or so. But basically, the Sandia Mountains are surrounded by development to the north of Tijeras Canyon. So maintaining habitat connectivity between the Sandias and the Manzano Mountains to the south is critical for maintaining wildlife species in the Sandias like mule deer, black bears, and cougars. And Jeff's cameras that are in the underpasses and at the crosswalk have picked up a number of animals, hundreds if not thousands of those three species, primarily using them in other animals as well. Just to provide a little more context, from a historic perspective, when Albuquerque was settled by Spaniards coming up from Mexico City, they brought indigenous people that ended up settling in the village of Carnway. And they basically were put there to act as a protection for Albuquerque back in the 1700s from raids by Comanches that would come from the Eastern Plains and come through Tijeras Canyon. And initially, the King of Spain granted about 500,000 acres to the Cañón de Carnway land grant. And over time, that land grant was whittled down. What started off as 500,000 acres is now 100 acres. And, you know, with the creation of the national forest, that took a lot of their land. And then when the freeway was built through the canyon, some of their land was condemned. So not only was Tijeras Canyon was habitat fragmentation created for wildlife, there was also a lot of cultural and social habitat fragmentation because the town of Carnway was basically split in half. So I just wanted to provide that cultural context there. Now maybe we could zoom in, Matt. So the project limits basically are the village of Tijeras on the east end, and then Carnway is kind of in the center, and then the eastern edge of Albuquerque on the west end. And there was already a pre-existing 6-foot chain link fence for part of the highway, I-40, through the small community of Carnway. So I want to give credit to the Tijeras Canyon Safe Passage Coalition that really pushed for this project and was able to kind of leverage Game and Fish and DOT to do the right thing. So the project itself ended up being kind of a integrated project like Jeff was talking about, which reduced costs. There was already a pre-existing highway improvement project planned for I-40, and we had a champion at the time in the DOT Environmental Bureau that decided to push for implementing some wildlife mitigation. And so about 5 miles of fence was built from the western edge of the village of Tijeras and tied into the 6-foot chain link that went through Carnway. So the red lines indicate where all that fencing is. And it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, because at the time, the district engineer didn't like 8-foot game fence, which is the standard woven wire fence that are used for pasture, you know, depredation, protection of pastures from large game animal depredation and that sort of thing. And the 8-foot game fence is very effective, but he didn't like the look of that. So he went for 8-foot chain link fence. And so there's several miles of 8-foot chain link that tied into several miles of electrified fence, which was also experimental. And we didn't, Game and Fish did not initially support that decision, but there was several miles of it that were installed. And basically it's 9 strands of cord that has a conducting metal woven into it, and it was electrified. And it worked really well for the first couple of years when it was under warranty. But after a while, the grass grows up, and this fence was installed basically on the south face of the Sandia Mountains. So it's very rugged and it's hard to get to. And the grass grew up and started shorting the fence out, and it was hard to maintain. So the fence basically stopped working, but it was very effective when it was functional at teaching local deer and other animals not to try to go through the electrified fence. And so they learned to cross at our crosswalk. On the eastern end of the project area, there is one underpass that's paved, and that's called the Public School Road Underpass. And that was really the only permeability point we had on the east end. And it's right as you come into the village of Tijeras. So people are automatically slowing down as they come into the village of Tijeras on Old Route 66. And there was a detection system installed here and also at the crosswalk on the west end. And that detection system was made by Econolite, and it never worked. They placed the cameras on poles, and the wind really howls through Tijeras Canyon. You could watch these poles just bounce back and forth in the wind. And so they could never sensitize the cameras enough to pick up wildlife. So basically that detection system was turned off permanently, and the blinking lights were activated to blink from dusk until dawn. So that's okay for this location on the east end of the project because people are coming into the village of Tijeras on Old Route 66, and so they automatically are slowing down. Jeff's cameras have not detected deer coming through that public school underpass for about 3 or 4 years of monitoring. There have been other animals, and I think we've got a picture of a bobcat coming through. I do know of anecdotal reports of deer being hit there, several deer that have been hit by people I know. So I know deer have come through there over the years, but it's, it's a developed area, particularly on the south side, and there's a school there, and there's a big cement mine there that we need to work with to try and protect that area from development whenever they close the mine out. And the Sandia Ranger District owns some property within the greater mine permit area that would be nice to do some kind of a land trade to protect this little corridor from that underpass up onto the forest, just to the west of the mine. But Jeff's cameras have documented mule deer. Well, this is actually, let me hold off on that for a minute. And so zooming back out, I think we can go to the crosswalk. So there are also escape ramps. I think there was a number of escape ramps built, and they were kind of over-engineered. They're very expensive. And so some of the more recent collision projects, mitigation projects that we've had have kind of scaled down the escape ramps where they're not nearly as expensive. So really the heart of this project was the crosswalk. And so we've got about 5 miles of fence that, animals will hit and they'll go left or right. And the fence actually stops at the at-grade crosswalk on the west end of the project area on New Mexico Highway 333. And so this little piece of property that you can't tell where the property boundary is, but right where our crosswalk is, where the red fence lines indicated in red stop, there was a little piece of property just on the north side that was owned by Gagnon de Carnway Land Grant. And this was kind of a key location for us to put this crosswalk. Here we're naturally crossing there, dropping down into Tijeras Arroyo and getting water. There's a plunge pool there that holds water during drought times, drought periods. And so they, you know, the local deer herds will cross right there and get water on a daily basis, and occasionally continue on down Tijeras Arroyo and cross under the I-40 bridge, effectively reconnecting the Sandia Mountains to the Manzanos. But before the fencing went in on the freeway in Old Route 66 at New Mexico 333, deer would try to cross the freeway right there too. There was, you could see trails going up from Tijeras Arroyo where they would cross, and it was pretty much a slaughter zone. It was a real dangerous area, and that's where they get hit a lot. So initially, it was very difficult to get the Cañón de Carnway land grant folks to participate or basically give their permission to implement this project. So we had to work very closely with them. They just did not have a lot of trust with the government because a lot of their land had been condemned, and they'd lost a lot of their land with forest designation. But they were concerned about large game animal vehicle collisions, so they did become a partner. They had a full steering committee member on the coalition and participated in it. And at the time, now Senator Martin Heinrich was actually head of the Albuquerque City Council. And so he wrote a bill and basically asked Secretary Rhonda Fott at the time, who was the Secretary of New Mexico Department of Transportation, to do a land trade for this little parcel on the north side of our proposed crosswalk. And so they ended up getting a much larger property on the east side of the Sandias in exchange for this tiny piece of property here, right at our crosswalk. That was key. And then something else that was really important was the Hawkwatch property. And you see this map here, and the Hawkwatch property is indicated in purple, and it's a 63-acre canyon that naturally funnels wildlife down to our crosswalk. And so you've got two different things going on. You've got the fence that ends right there at our crosswalk, where there's a gap in the fence, and then that funnels animals into the crosswalk, and also the canyon itself funnels animals to the crosswalk. So we were able to work with now Senator Martin Heinrich and Scott Wilbur of New Mexico Land Conservancy to find a conservation buyer for that property, which was Albuquerque Open Space. And we're fortunate that it didn't get bought by a developer, because there was a developer interested in it. And so Albuquerque Open Space did a conservation easement on that property, and it's being managed, as far as I know, the only Albuquerque open space property that's managed as a wildlife corridor. And it ties in very nicely with the Sandia Mountain Wilderness on the north and some other Albuquerque open space just to the west of this. So the construction was going on basically simultaneously with these land deals. So it really came together. I think the stars truly aligned because we did not really, get onto the land protection issue until the project was underway. But basically the project was completed in 2007, and the crosswalk, as Jim Hirsch stated earlier in the video, includes 2 electrified mats that are shown here where the cursors are. And this is the 3rd generation of these mats. The initial installation of them back in 2007, they basically just dug grooves in the pavement and laid down a conductor and then grouted them in and then hooked it up to the electric fence. So it was all basically one unit. But over time, again, it lasted 2 years during the warranty, but over time, the grout failed and those conductors started popping up out of the road. So after a couple of years, the electrified mats didn't work. And so they came back and replaced those. And the ones that you see here are actually a 3rd generation, and they're called electrocrete, which is, it's sort of a special formulation of concrete that has conductor embedded in it. And they lay in a aluminum grid and they come in and sand it down. And so it's got positive and negative pads. So an animal has to actually place a paw or a foot on both a positive and negative to get a shock. But these are still working and they're very functional. So again, the concept is animals get funneled down to this crosswalk. The electrified mats keep them within the crosswalk, and then they can drop down and get water in Tijeras Canyon for their daily movements, or continue on down Tijeras Arroyo and cross under the highway, under I-40, which has effectively reconnected the Sandia and Manzano Mountains. And Jeff's cameras documented a couple of bucks, you know, with fairly unique antlers or racks that they were able to tie to the underpass. So they have clearly documented animals moving across the crosswalk and then under I-40. So there are two other projects that were kind of tied into this. They were associated, but I don't really consider them part of the Tijeras Canyon State Passage project. They came later. And one is the fencing was extended using 8-foot game fence from the village of Tijeras to Zuzax. And this is a project that did not have any passages associated with it. There's one culvert that bears were using, and then an underpass that's paved on Old Route 66 or New Mexico 333 that wildlife can use. And then the third project is further east. And the Tijeras Canyon State Passage Coalition successfully advocated for this feasibility study to look at I-40 and assess the need for wildlife vehicle collision mitigation. And Paul Knight with Marin and Associates did that study. It was the first of its kind in the state. And he documented that this area further east by Edgewood, which is a transition zone between pinyon juniper woodland and grassland, actually had the highest number of deer vehicle collisions. So a separate project that was implemented by Jeff Radine, who was in the DOT Environmental Bureau at the time, using Highway Safety Improvement Program funding, which was again a novel move for New Mexico Department of Transportation. It constructed just a fencing project using the standard 8-foot woven wire fence from Edgewood to, I think it's called Mountain Overpass or something like that. I forget what the county road is, but there's an overpass that ties it in. And there is an existing bridge there that deer were already using, and Jeff's cameras documented a herd of whitetail deer using it, which seemed a little far west for me, but whitetails have been spotted in the Sandias and even in the Corrales Bosque now, so they're moving west. And so we've got some photos. Eastbridge? Yeah, or the crosswalk. Some critter photos that just prove that animals are actually using them. So one thing interesting about some of the photos we got at the crosswalk was this red fox, and I wasn't aware that there were red fox in the Sandias, but there are. And also a ringtail, which is pretty cool. They tend to like rocky habitats, so they're pretty widespread throughout the state, but you just don't see them. They're nocturnal. And I've never seen them using a wildlife crossing before, so that was pretty unique. What else? Yeah.
$1 or $8.
There's a buck jumping over the guardrail, and the guardrail had to be raised. It's a new standard height that DOT has, so they raised the guardrail. But we've seen, you know, Jeff's cameras have documented deer going over, easily jumping over, and also crawling under. So it's not really a barrier to them. What about Eastbridge? And then we've got some photos that were taken underneath the East Bridge, which is sort of the major connectivity point from the crosswalk to the Manzanos, of a couple of cougars. And the Arizona Game and Fish cameras have picked up a number of cougars moving back and forth. And a former schoolmate of mine actually got a contract with Kirtland Air Force Base to collar cougars, and he's doing a cougar study there. And Jeff's cameras have picked up a number of collared cougars moving back and forth under this bridge and the next bridge west. And an interesting story about one of his young male cougars. It was collared on Kirtland Air Force Base, which is kind of on the southeast side of Albuquerque in the Manzano Mountains. And it moved to the Sandias, where apparently it had a female and spent some time there. Then went west and crossed under I-25 at Sandia Pueblo and hung out on the Rio Grande Bosque for a month or so, where apparently it had another female, and then made that same trip back to the Sandias and then under I-40, apparently, into the Manzanos and hung out there. And it made that trip several times before it was finally hit on I-40 east of Tijeras. So they, as Glenn Harper's presentation showed you yesterday, they really can travel long distances, and they're so stealthy and nocturnal that you rarely see them. So what about the rainbow? Got that. So I think that's about it for our presentation. I did want to show this last photograph. You know, the organizers of this summit initially wanted to do a field site visit. We ended up feeling like, you know, it's sort of a safety issue because it's heavy traffic in the parking area at the base of the Hawkwatch property. You can only get a couple of vehicles in there. We need to do hard hats and safety vests. So logistically, it just didn't make a lot of sense for a bigger group of folks. So hopefully this will give people a sense of that. And if anybody wants to go out there, Matt or I would be happy to take, you know, smaller groups of people out there at some point. Appreciate it. So this photograph, if we can get it up, I was traveling out to Tijeras Canyon at one point and opportunistically took a photo of this rainbow right where we want our overpass to go. There's a point where New Mexico Highway 333 goes under the freeway at what they call the S-curve, and that would be the ideal place for an overpass because there's a big slope on the north side and a little bit of a slope, I think, on the south side, but the south end is Canyon de Carnoy land grant land. So if we ever have the opportunity to build an overpass there, hopefully they would be willing to work with us to do that. So thank you for participating in this virtual experiment. And we can certainly take questions if anybody has them.
Let's see. I don't see any questions on Zoom.
You know, I haven't quantified them. We've got about 10 projects, again, depending on how you define them. Yeah, I don't even want to guess. We've got 3 on Aztec. And it also depends on how you define crossings. We have no overpasses. You know, some of our projects are retrofits. We've got 2 large bridges on US 550 south of Cuba where there's just fence installed to direct animals to use it. You know, there's multiple culverts for I-40 at Tijeras Canyon, but they're smaller culverts. They're not big enough for ungulates to use, but you know, the smaller carnivores can use them. And then Raton's got a number of them too, probably 5 or 6. So I'd say in the range of 20. And several crosswalks now because the US 550 project south of Cuba, you know, the fence has to end somewhere. And generally you try to tie them in to another bridge where animals could go under or to a cliff face. So you don't get these end run events. You're just creating another problem where the fence ends unless you can tie it into something. So on US 550 south of Cuba, we've got the 2 large bridges and about 4 miles of fence, an animal detection system on each end, but that's effectively a crosswalk where the fence ends because it's just ending out in space. It's not tied into another bridge. And we've got several bridges on a project on US 64 west of Chama too.
And of course, some of our crossings, Jeff showed photos earlier. I think it's Raton, actually trafficked overpasses, you know, for vehicles, but deer use those as well. So it's not really a live crossing, but it's utilized in fishing does tie into it, cattle animals to cross there.
Yeah, and Jeff made this point about the difference between sort of wild herds and urbanized herds of deer and black bears. And Raton just seems to be a hot spot for urbanized wildlife, and they just exhibit behavior that I think Jeff hasn't seen routinely and certainly was new to us. And they just hang out right next to the road, and they use these paved overpasses over the freeway. And so do cougars and black bears, and they're using much smaller culverts than you would normally expect mule deer to use. And so Raton's full of wildlife. And they're using the passages to get in and out of town, basically, but they love to hang out in town for whatever reason. So thank you, guys.
Wrap things up, tied up in bow here real quick, but just thank you again to everyone. I mean, what an excellent round of presenters that we've had these past 2 days, and gosh, it's such an exciting time on this topic, I think, across the West, but probably around the world, really. I mean, I think with the, as I alluded to earlier, with the advent of, you know, cheaper, more affordable GPS technology that's allowing us to see where animals want to go and how they want to move across landscapes, it can really help pinpoint areas that we need to conserve and work on. And it also has the added benefit, obviously, of increasing safety for motorists and helping prevent unnecessary deaths and accidents across the states. And such a great investment, and how rare it is to see an issue in this day and age where it's just not polarizing at all. I mean, really, it is supported by all walks of life. They immediately get it. I mean, if even 4-year-olds, I think, understand the need to build more wildlife crossings in this country. So it's an issue that sells itself. But once again, thanks again to all of our sponsors. As John pointed out earlier, the New Mexico Wildlife Federation, which did a great job. Adrian here running the show, Master of Ceremony, New Mexico Wild, Defenders of Wildlife, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, the Wildlands Network, National Wildlife Federation, Pew Charitable Trust, and of course the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, which provided the great technology to allow this hybrid event to happen. I just talked with Jesse this morning, and these recordings of these presentations will be going up on nmwildlife.org. Is that you?
More than likely, we'll email to everybody that registered for both the in-person and the Zoom, and so they'll just go directly to inboxes when they're.
Okay, great. They'll be going to inboxes, but they will live on those sites, and it'll allow, I think, over the coming months, you know, more visitors to attend these great presentations and draw what we have drawn the last few days. So again, thank you all so much for coming, and all of our guests online. We had great participation over these last few days. I think, you know, at least around 50 to 60, you know, for every presentation. So good stuff, and safe trip home, and thank you for your contributions to wildlife crossings and connectivity in New Mexico.